we're tackling haunted house as far as the theme for this list. And there are certain tropes that I found. I didn't like look it up. I'm sure if I like Google, I'd see like what the exact tropes were. So this is just based on the 10 movies we decided to watch. The themes that I've noticed pop up a lot, and Indian burial grounds seem to be like a big thing. Like, and
Yes, absolutely.
I don't know what's the difference between a sacred Indian burial ground is, or like a just a Indian burial ground. Or I
Yeah.
guess I should say Native American, because this is more like, you know, Native American type Indians than
Yes.
Indian Indians. Um, it's, I guess, if it's the Christopher Columbus type Indians, I guess
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
that's referred to in these stories. That's a theme. Also, the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren are a
Yes.
theme. And I haven't done
Yes.
a lot of research on them. I was made aware of them when The Conjuring came out. Supposedly they're a bunch of charlatans. Like a lot of their stories are made up. They hired people to make up these stories. I think like the husband is accused of being like a sexual predator. A lot of it seems to just be like they're religious nuts, and there's a lot of their lectures and stuff seem to all like go back to like, well, if you follow God and Jesus and like that'll be yours. It seems to me more about religion and things like that. And they just like supposedly like the Annabelle doll is just like a Raggedy Ann doll they put in a case, and then they made up stories about it. And it's a lot of it sounds like a Twilight Zone episode where Talking Tina type story. Like when I watched the movie, that's what I saw. But then when I did a little bit of research when the movie actually came out, I did see online there were some links to that. People who like call them out did mention that because it made sense, because that's the first thing that popped in my head was Talking Tina when I saw that stuff. For me, I don't believe in all that stuff to begin with. When I heard they were like bullshit artists, even if I didn't hear that, I wouldn't believe them anyway. And supposedly, like if you do see them in person, their stories aren't even that convincing. But if we're gonna deal with this, they are the Al Capone, what Al Capone is to gangster movies, or what Ed Gein is to slasher movies. The Warrens, I think, are to haunted house films.
Oh, yeah, that seems to be the case. And I was going to raise that issue too in the discussion of a specific movie later on. But yeah, I don't really know much about them personally. And that is one of the questions that I think you have to ask is, how much do we believe in them? How much do we believe their stories? And should that affect the movie? If we know that the story's kind of bullshit, does that affect our enjoyment of the movie, or can we just
So
accept it?
so obviously when we talk about the movies individually, that's when we can really get into that. But for me,
Yes.
it wouldn't affect my viewing of the movie on any level, because like, I mean, I don't have to believe in Superman. I don't have to believe a man can fly to like enjoy a Superman movie. For me, the only thing that it affects me with is when they're portrayed to be heroes,
Yeah.
when in real life we know they're scumbags. It's one thing for me to enjoy a slasher movie that's inspired by Ed Gein, but if they're trying to make the Ed Gein uh, surrogate out to be a hero, I mean, like, no, fuck this. Like, he's fucking, he should be the bad guy. The same thing with like the
Yeah.
Scarface type character. Like, if something's based on Al Capone, even if the character is charismatic, as long as they're not portrayed to be like a person of high character. I love the portrayal of the Scarface character that was inspired by Al Capone. I think he's incredibly charismatic, fun to watch. But two things. One is it's lightly inspired by. It's not like it's based on a true story like some of
Hmm.
these movies claim to be, which, horror movies, a lot of them tend to lean into based on a true story to drum
Yes.
up more scares. So it's not like these movies that portray Al Capone are trying to be true to life. They're just using gangster stories and a gangster, some kind of inspiration frameworking of the stories. But also, you kind of, A, you like them ironically because you think they're idiots. And B, you're just into the story. You don't actually feel like, man, that real Al Capone is a real hero. You don't leave the movie saying, like, Al Capone is a great guy, even if you think, man, that Scarface character, man, what a fucking awesome character, you know? You don't think, man, I
Yeah.
idolize Al Capone now, man, that guy was really, I don't leave the movie thinking that. But I think
Yeah.
with the portrayal of the Warrens, like the idea is that you're supposed to leave these movies thinking, man, those guys were like real crusaders, like they did a great
Hmm.
job, they helped out these people. To me, that's the part that feels icky.
Well, like you said, we'll get into it more on the individual movies. But yeah, I agree. It's something to do with portraying them in a way that isn't even questioned in terms of are they for real or are they con people? Like the movie never even goes there, really. It just kind of presents them as if they are nothing but real, and above reproach, like Superman or something.
Yes, like
And
Superman.
Superman doesn't claim to be a true story, so that might be the difference. If they said this is true and this
Hmm.
really happened, you might
Yeah.
go, wait a minute, this isn't quite working for me. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, I mean those are the two ones that really stuck out to me. It seems like all of the movies on this list and even some of the movies we considered leaned into the burial ground stuff or the Warrens in some kind of way. There are other tropes that are there,
Yes.
but those were the two ones that really stuck out to me. It's like, man, like how many burial grounds are people going to build houses on? Like, like how many like
Yeah.
these ghost hunters are going to be popping up and just things like
Yeah.
that. So, but
Yeah.
overall, I did find this as an enjoyable watch. I'm surprised that like they weren't one thing that I was a hesitancy for me going into is like I thought they'd feel more like bottled movies, where it's like a lot of these movies, man, like I'd just be watching like 10 straight movies of people inside the house. A lot of them
Hmm.
do have a lot of scenes outside of the house as well. So they don't feel as claustrophobic. I think only like maybe or just off the top of my head, as we get into the movies, like I'll re-remember for sure. But I think only for the most part it was Paranormal Activity that didn't ever leave the house.
Yeah.
Um, but I think with the others, I think there were a decent amount of scenes outside the house. So
Yeah.
you definitely want to mix in those visuals, unless you like, there's narrative reasons why you don't leave the house, just to give you like a visual break of like what you're watching.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think these movies are all very different from one another in a way, too. Like we've chosen some very different things here. At least a couple of them are very different from the others. And I mean, there's lots of great movies that we did not put on this list. And I know we always say this kind of thing, but these aren't necessarily the very best of the best, and they're not necessarily my personal favorites, although some of them are. But there's plenty of other ones that I love as well. So there's a lot of good haunted house movies out there, I think.
Yeah, I think with every list we have to preference that in that it's not the 10 best. I think with this list in particular, that really reigns true because there's these are not the 10 best. But I definitely think they're definitely the most essential.
Hmm.
And again, when we get into them, I'll delve more into some of the films that I think aren't that great, but
Yeah.
why they kind of deserve to be there over films that are better.
Yeah. Excellent.
All right, so unless there's anything else you'd like to add to the overall context of what we're going to be talking about, I guess we can head into this list.
Yeah, let's do it.
So we're going to start off with the silent film The Cat and the Canary from 1927. So I didn't do a lot of research on this film. I watched it several years ago and I rewatched it again for this list. So I don't know if there was actual a soundtrack for this or if it was just a silent film that's just literally silent. But it is kind of off-putting because I have seen a lot of silent films, but there's usually like some kind of soundtrack to
Yeah.
like cue you emotionally.
I have this DVD here in my collection, and it does have music on it. It has a soundtrack.
Oh,
So
okay. Well,
there
that answers that
definitely,
question.
yeah, there definitely are some out there for sure.
Okay. So, do you know if that was added later or was that part of the original movie? Because sometimes they do that as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they added it later. So, there would have been music in the theater. Somebody probably would have been playing the piano or the organ or something. But I think this was just created for this edition. I'm pretty sure the music
Okay.
that's here.
Okay.
Yeah.
How dare you interrupt me when
I'm trying. I'm trying.
I'm talking? But yeah, so for me, that added to it because One is I'm so used to multitasking. Like I'm sure a lot of people are, where it's like you can watch a movie, but it doesn't have to have your full attention. So when you're seeing something that's only visual, where there's just no sound to cue you in on what's going on, if your eyes leave the screen, you don't know what's going on. It's like you can't depend on words or any kind of audio cues as to like what you're missing when your eyes aren't fixed on the screen. To me, that added to the feel and the watching experience of the movie is it had to have my full attention. It also subtracted from it as well because it's not the greatest movie in the world. So it's kind of like, man, of the 10 movies on this list, this is the one that I have to pay the most attention to, whether I want to or not. And it's probably the least enjoyable of them. But it's definitely important to be on this list because it's from 1927. So it's kind of one of like these original, if not like the first, one of the first, because when you talk about movies this old, they weren't meant to be seen almost, Jesus, almost 100 years later. My
Yeah,
God.
yeah.
It's like they weren't meant to be seen like 100 years later and still be around. So this is something like I found out when I first started watching films as like a film buff or a film historian type of level, is that you realize some of these older movies that are considered like these great silent films, they're not necessarily like the best silent films, to do a callback to our list. It's not necessarily the best. They are the most essential because they are the ones that survived. So it's like we don't really know like which were the best movies that came out in 1901, 1902, 1910, 1920. We just know the best of the ones that survived. So of the very old silent movies, one of the original silent movies that have survived, this is definitely one of the more important ones because there are very few horror movies from this era that have survived and very few haunted house movies. So the idea to be able to go back in time and see like how where we were as far as like horror movies and haunted house movies, this is definitely an important watch as far as that goes. And it also gives you the tone of these horror movies because especially with haunted house movies and ghost movies, they weren't taken very seriously for a long time. It wouldn't be for a couple more decades where you would get like a serious ghost movie because ghosts were looked at as silly or stupid, until the Warrens came along and showed us how scary they really are. But yeah, people didn't take ghost stories seriously back then. So the fact that this is a comedy I didn't really love the comedic elements. I loved comedies, but for me, a slapstick comedy is probably like my least favorite. And unless it's like a really good Jim Carrey movie or like a really good Marx Brothers movie or like a really good Abbott and Costello movie, there are some slapstick comedies I like, but for the most part, it's not my favorite comedy. And this is kind of like they really went for the slapstick with the humor in this one.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but this movie is a perfect example of when they made movies about ghosts in the 20s and even into the 30s, they often wound up not really being about ghosts, right? It was sort of, it's somebody, some human person is behind this. It's not really ghosts. It's sort of like a Scooby-Doo episode in that way, like they set it up as, oh, there might be ghosts here, but it's really a human being. The ghosts aren't real. And so that is something that comes a bit later, as you said. And I actually enjoyed this movie quite a bit for what it is. It was based on a play originally, and it's been turned into at least 4 different movies over the years. They've really this is a story they keep redoing, and I think it's one of the first and best of the so-called old dark house movies, and that's kind of most of the old dark house movies are like that, where there's supposedly maybe supernatural, there's things going on there, but then they wind up kind of not really being supernatural. It's more there's an explanation for it in the end. But what really, first of all, when they made this movie, they hired a director from Germany who was actually a German expressionism director, and part of the reason was that they were afraid that the movie would be a little too static because it was a play. They didn't want it to just look like a play that was being filmed. So they brought this guy in who had a real distinct visual style. And I think that that part of it really works. Like I really love the opening of the movie where you see the house, which is kind of like a castle. It's like an old scary looking house in the background, and you see the old man kind of sitting in the foreground. And then as they talk about his drinking or his drugs that he's taking or his medicines or whatever, suddenly the castle sort of turns into bottles, and it sort of becomes all these bottles that were dominating his life. And then he talks, or they talk about how he viewed his relatives as being cats, and he was the canary, you know, because they're all surrounding him and wanting his money. And so they had these shots of cats sort of swiping at him. And so it's very surreal and artistic. It's very interesting looking.
I did like that, and I wish they would have stopped there. I really wish they would have stopped there, but they weren't convinced that we got the analogy, and man, did they hammer that analogy home. I can't. It
Oh,
must have
yeah.
been like 20 times in like this movie that they brought up the analogy of the cat and the canary. Even
Yes.
like with the killer, with the reading of
Yes.
the will, it's like holy shit, like we
Yes.
get it.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
like this isn't
Yeah.
some like very like clever vague analogy that if you don't explain it 30 times in your movie, we're not going to understand what you're talking about. But they did really,
Yeah.
really hammer that point home about the cat and the canary.
They did, and I found it a little bit refreshing because a lot of movies they have a title and you don't even know why it's the title. You know, you finish the movie and you go, why did they call it that? But in this case, we know why they called it The Cat and the
Oh, we
Canary.
know.
They
We
really,
know.
they really did. They made it very clear. So they worked that title over and over again. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing that I found really interesting about this is, I mean, I saw it many, many years ago, and I couldn't really remember it very well. But when I was younger, I directed a play called The Real Inspector Hound by Tom Stoppard. And I guess it's actually meant to be a direct spoof of The Mousetrap by Agatha Christie. But I just viewed it as a spoof of all murder mystery plays. And I was very surprised watching this, how I could see a lot of the exact same things that are in uh, The Real Inspector Hound, which was first done in 1968. And a lot of those things are right here, you know, like they're in this play from the 20s or this movie from the late 20s, um, you know, with the creepy housekeeper, the escaped lunatic, you know, the phone lines being cut. Like there's so many things in here that are so exactly in that play all those years later. And I assume they're probably in Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap, but I actually haven't seen The Mousetrap, so I'm not sure. But it's this movie, you can see how influential it was because it's still, you know, almost, you know, 40 years later, people are kind of using the same tropes and the same ideas in other plays or movies. So this really does establish a lot of the things I think that we see in these type of movies.
Yeah. The only thing I was surprised is at the ending, they didn't go with, wait a minute, are these ghosts real? Because that's usually how these movies end. It's like you
Yeah.
figure out the ghost is fake, the heroine and the hero come together, and then just as they're about to kiss or something, like something spooky happens, and then they look at each other like, "Uh-oh, wait a minute,
Yeah.
there's something real actually going on in the house."
Yeah.
That would have been a nice touch since they're going for the comedy anyway. But again, this wasn't my favorite on the list, but it was
Mhm.
very important, and I think we both agreed that it definitely deserved to be on this list for reasons, obviously that
Yes.
you mentioned and we already got into.
Yes.
Not a difficult watch. The only difficult thing is that you do have to have give it your full attention. Like you can't
Yes.
necessarily like multitask while you're watching it, and that is something that in this day and age you have to make people aware of.
Yeah.
It is a short movie. It does have a few moments that are interesting, and even if it's moments that you've seen before, you have to keep in mind, well, you've seen it before because it's been emulated, as you
That's
mentioned.
right. That's right.
since then. So it's always good to go back to some of these original movies.
Yes, for sure. Okay, so are we ready to move on to the next one on the list? Yes. So the next one is actually a movie called The Uninvited from 1944. And it follows this quite well in the sense that this movie, well, first of all, my own personal story of this movie is that I actually saw this in a theater. It was a midnight screening. One of the local art house theaters here called the Cinematheque. They did this series of movies at midnights, and I guess they must have been ghost stories. Like this is many years ago, and this was one of the movies they showed, and I went to see it with a couple of friends, and I think our reaction to it was, well, it's not really that scary. It's not really much of a horror film. It kind of felt more like a drama or maybe a romance. We weren't all that impressed with it at that point. But watching it now, I really liked it, and I thought this is a very good movie. And I think it is very influential and groundbreaking because, unlike the old Dark House films, including The Cat and the Canary, this is one of the first, or maybe the first movie where it deals with ghosts as if they are real. And it takes them very seriously. It's not a slapstick comedy. It's a very serious drama. And I think it sort of establishes that format that has become so popular in ghost stories, which is that there is some kind of a past crime or a past injustice, and the ghost cannot rest until this is dealt with in some way, until the truth comes out about something that happened in the past. And that's very much what this story is about. And I mean, this would go on to be, TV shows like The Ghost Whisperer would, just do this week after week. It's this, the ghost cannot move on until this past injustice or crime or whatever it is dealt with. So that this could be the first. This could be where it started. And I think it also contains a lot of the elements that we would see again and again in haunted house stories, including things like a dog who knows that there's something wrong. How many movies do we see that in here? And this dog, he refuses to live in the house. He takes off and he's gone. And there's also a cat that refuses to go up the stairs in this house, so the animals know there's something wrong. And another thing is the sort of shut up or the secret room that we see in a lot of movies. And they're cold, it's cold, or there's cold spots. It's unusually cold. And there's mysterious sounds that occur at the same time every night. And also they perform a seance in this movie, which is something that we will see in other movies as well. And I think it was something that was very popular back then. Like people just liked going to seances. It was kind of a thing to do, to try and contact the dead. So I think it may have come out of that, but it's certainly become a bit of a thing that we do see in ghost stories. Overall, I think it's a real kind of sincere human drama, and it has real emotion in it. It's not quite a horror film in a way, but it is a supernatural drama, and it is a romance, and it does generate some suspense and some creepy atmosphere. I suspect that the audiences in 1944 were probably a little more scared of it because they probably weren't used to this kind of story. But in any case, it was a huge hit. It was a huge hit. And it led to a sort of unrelated sequel called The Unseen in 1945, which was same director and the same star, Gail Russell, who this movie kind of made her. She was kind of an unknown, and people loved her in this movie, so she went on to a long career. And the story here is about a brother and sister who are vacationing, and they decide to buy this house, this old house. And he is a composer. And the song that he composes in the movie actually went on to become a bit of a jazz standard in real life. And people like Frank Sinatra and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis actually recorded the song, so that's something interesting that came out of this movie. But anyway, I think it's a good movie, and I enjoyed it, and I certainly liked it better than when I was 20 or however old I was the first time. Um, it's not totally horror in a way, but I think it is a valid ghost story, and it deserves to be on this list.
I agree with one of the early points you made where it kind of dabbles in a little bit of like, is this a horror? Is this a love story? And I think that's where it may lose certain contemporary audiences in that a lot of the enjoyment of a movie is expectations. If you go in expecting one thing and you get another, people don't like that, that subversion. They want to know what they're getting, and they want to know what to expect, and if they're in the mood for a comedy, they want a comedy. If they're in the mood for horror, they want a horror. And then when you kind of play with their expectations, it kind of peeve people off a little bit. And with this one, it's hard to categorize it. It's 100% haunted house, but is it fully horror, or is it more romance, or is it there's a little bit of comedy in there too? So it does dabble around. To me, what helps this movie come together is that it really adds a lot of mystery to these haunted house movies that would come back in would be fully established in future haunted house movies, where it's a lot of times horror is suspense. Horror is its own genre, but if you really wanted to look at it a little bit deeper, it's kind of a subgenre of suspense movies. And suspense is really what pushes a lot of horror movies. And this kind of showed, hey, like, you know what? Mystery instead of suspense can push these horror movies. And that's, again, in future movies, you would have that. You would have like, well, is this house haunted? Why is it haunted? Is there a ghost? Why is this ghost here? What can we do to make this ghost leave? Well, we have to know why they died. Who killed them? Why did they kill them? And kind of things like that. And that's what really drives the movie, and really, I think, would hold people's interest. It's the mystery of what's going on. One of the main reasons I wanted to have this movie on the list is because, one, it was super successful. And with horror movies, that's not always the case. Horror movies are really popular because they don't cost a lot, so they don't have to make a lot to be profitable. And a lot of times a horror movie can be considered great in hindsight because it's a cult classic. So for instance, like The Thing, the second version in the 80s, that wasn't that successful. E.T. was the movie that really like made a ton of money, but people don't really talk about E.T. like that anymore. But E.T. is like financially one of the most successful movies ever made, but people still talk about The Thing. But The Thing didn't really make a lot of money. So this is one of those horror movies that actually did make a lot of money. So it's important to have it on a list because of that, and because of some of the stuff you mentioned, some of these staples that would, after this movie, be full staples of haunted house movies moving forward. One movie I did think about putting on this list instead of that, that was in between Cat and the Canary and this, was The Old Dark House. So it was kind of a mix of like, man, which one should we go with? Because The Old Dark House, I think that was a movie that kind of coined the phrase haunted house movie. And I think the reason, like for me, I'm sure you have your own reasons why I felt going with this one over The Old Dark House, is because The Old Dark House didn't really make any money. It's only known today because it's a cult film for like film buffs like me and yourself, and also because of who directed it, the guy that directed James Whale, the guy that directed Frankenstein. So for me, that's kind of like what gave this movie the edge and kept it on the list, is that, yeah, it was financially successful. It established a lot of the things that we look on now today. I think, even though certain aspects of it hasn't aged well, it's aged well enough that I think modern audiences would definitely enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think the Old Dark House, of course, is part of that older style where it turns out it's not really supernatural. It's more explained to us in the end, whereas this one really does go full on supernatural, which I think is an important difference between the two.
Next on this list, we have The Innocents. So with this movie and the next movie, they were both in the early 60s. There was another movie that's not on this list. I think it was in 59, House on Haunted Hill.
Yes.
And I didn't House on Haunted Hill was a movie like initially when we made this list, I'm like, that's gotta be on this list.
Hmm.
But I didn't think it was greatest haunted house movies ever made. I didn't think three of the movies should be within like like a 4 year span of each other.
Yeah.
So it's
Uh,
like that's one of the reasons why that movie isn't on this list. And
yeah.
the other reason,
It's one of my favorites too, by the way. House on Haunted Hill. I love that movie.
yeah, yeah. And another reason why it's not on the list is because it wasn't really that financially successful either. Accidentally good. And we already have another movie on this list that had very little effort put into it that we're going to get into that I'm not a huge fan of because it's looked like, man, did they even try? So I didn't want to have too many movies on this list that are essential that it's like, man, did the filmmakers really even try to make a good movie? I know all of that has nothing to do with The Innocents, but because that movie's not going to be on this list, now is kind of the time where I wanted to mention why it's not on the list. But it's definitely way up there as far as my enjoyment, and I'm sure your enjoyment as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now to get back to the movie that is on this list, The Innocents. So for me, this is one of my favorite all-time horror movies. It's just brilliant. So this is based on a play, and the play is based on a book. The book is Turn Up the Screw. The play is The Innocents, and then the movie is kind of an amalgamation of the two, plus some original ideas brought into by the writer Truman Capote. So it's kind of like an amalgamation of Truman Capote's take on things, the play's take on things, and the book itself. And I think all of those things come together really wonderfully. And this is kind of an interesting thing as far as the casting goes, in that Deborah Kerr, I think, is the lead actress.
Yes.
Uh, it's you always see older men play younger characters. So this character is supposed to be late teens, early 20s. Deborah Kerr's in her 40s. You see that all the time with male actors, but with women, you almost never see that. And this is a situation where it does happen, and it is very noticeable because it's clear this character was written as someone in her 20s or late teens, and they didn't adjust the script at all. For me, that's the only knock I have against this movie,
Mm.
because otherwise I think it's just brilliant, is that they don't adjust it to the cast. I did a movie called They Almost Die. Not the greatest movie in the world, obviously. I mean, I made it with the change in my out of my pocket, but it actually did make a lot of money. It made me like almost 15 grand.
Wow.
Um, that's what horror movies do. They cost a couple $100, and sometimes they can make like way more than what you spend.
Yeah.
Again, there's another movie on this list that cost a couple $100 and made way more than 15 grand that we'll get to later. But
Yes.
so for me, like I had written that as like an urban ghetto version of I Spit on Your Grave.
Wow.
And I was like, man, that's going to be my take on I Spit on Your Grave. And I wrote it for a young, naive girl that comes to the hood, and she's white, and she just acts like super entitled. And then, here comes these thugs that and you can, if you're familiar with I Spit on Your Grave, you kind of know what happens next.
Yes, I
So,
can guess.
yes, yes.
I can guess.
This is on YouTube, so I won't get into specifics on what happens next. When I wrote the movie that way and I cast it, like I had the perfect girl. She was, she hit I think she was in her early 20s, so she was perfect fit. She actually came from money as well. So she couldn't have been more perfect for the fit. However, when it came time to shoot with a lot of independent films, people aren't contractually bound to show up. You're dealing with people that have regular jobs, just dudes or chicks you meet or online who answer ads and things like that. So some of the guys didn't show up. I only had one of the three guys show up to shoot. I had the girl and one of the three guys, and I just couldn't do the movie. So with the delays, I ended up losing her as my lead actress. and I ended up getting a different lead actress that wasn't flowery, blonde, curly hair, coming from money, early 20s. She was still white because that's what I was casting for, because the racial dynamic was always a major part of it. But she was older. She was a former stripper. She wasn't augmented or anything. I only mentioned, so the stripping part doesn't play a factor as far as visually. I just mentioned it to say that she was savvy when it came to dealing with horny guys, and like she didn't have that innocence, you know. It's just like,
Mm.
fuck off me, like, you know, she would curse back, and she didn't seem like a woman that would take shit.
Mm.
She was mature, she was savvy, she was grizzled in a way, I guess you could say. I don't know if that's a polite term to use when you're talking about a woman. But so if I kept the script the way it was, it just wouldn't work. And so I completely changed the script, and it didn't take away from the movie, but I always think you should adapt your script to who you cast, especially if you're casting someone that doesn't fit what's written on the page. And for me, that does show a lot when you watch this movie. Why is Deborah Kerr acting like that? It's like, you know, she's not. Is she that naive and that it just didn't make any sense? So it is a little bit jarring. Some of that is taken away because of the black and white softens her up a little bit, but you can tell this is like a mature woman. It's like she shouldn't be acting the way she is. So that's a little off-putting. And also, they went for the glam type look, where it's like she looked like she came from money, but she's supposed to be poor. And also towards the end of the movie, where she should be looking disheveled, she should be looking crazy, she should be looking like demented. She still looks like gorgeous, perfect 10 Deborah Kerr. It's just like, yeah. Like there were a couple of points where it's just like, man, this is a great movie, but there's another movie on this list that's perfect. And those are the elements that really separate great from just like classic. But aside from those nitpicks, this is an amazing movie, amazing performance from Deborah Kerr, great storytelling. Talk about creepy kids. I mean, Truman Capote, a lot of their lines came directly from Truman, if you're familiar with his writing, came directly from Truman Capote. The themes, the way they handled the horror elements, the way they handled, is this in her head or is this really happening? They told that line very, very well. Where it's just like you could watch the movie believing either scenario. Because even with me, when I do write mysteries and things like that, I always say, like, I'm gonna write, of all the major characters, I'm gonna write it each from their point of view. And this isn't a situation where they're writing the characters from different point of views, but they're writing stories from different point of views, as if it happened with the ghost and if it didn't happen with the ghost. And I think that's something we talked about earlier, where it's like, are we talking about real ghosts or are we talking about fake ghosts? And this movie does both of those things that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, well, this is this is a great movie. I think Stephen King at some point put it on a list of the scariest movies ever, that are just scary because they are, and that's what made me really want to see it. And I actually read The Turn of the Screw many years ago. I read that book and I really liked it. I found it very compelling and suspenseful. And I must admit, when I got to the end of the book, I wasn't really so sure what happened, you know, and I reread the ending a couple of times and tried to figure it out. And I was never really 100% sure how to take the ending. And it's been a long time now, so I can't even remember it too well. But in some ways, I feel like this movie is a great version of it. But it also kind of at the end, I'm left a little bit confused, and maybe it is that question of, is it real? Is it not real? Is it in our head? Is it, you know, I'm not sure how to take the ending, and I don't want to get into spoilers or anything like that. But do you have any thoughts about that aren't spoilers?
It's a little pedophilic at the end. That's not a
Yes,
spoiler.
yes. Well, that's true. Yeah, I agree with that.
So I did do some research on this film. I think the consensus from the people who have studied the book and is that it's about sexual repression. And if
Hmm.
you don't think it's about sexual repression, then the book is overrated. If you
Okay.
do think it's about sexual repression, then it's a brilliant work of art. I think that's kind of the consensus of it. If you do think it's a ghost story, I don't think people would still be talking about the book today, and I don't think people will find the movie fascinating if it was just a ghost story.
Yeah.
So, for if you love it, I think it's because you think it's more than just a ghost story.
Yeah.
If that says enough without spoiling it completely.
It does. It does. And I think that, yeah, that's kind of the feeling I got from both the book and the movie, that there's more to this. It's
Mhm,
deeper. There's
mhm.
something going on here. And I wasn't 100% sure. Like, it doesn't really give you all the answers necessarily, but I felt that there was definitely something more than a ghost story here.
Mhm.
But,
And I think they did shoot it interestingly too, because if you notice, when the ghosts do arrive, right? This is something I noticed on this recent rewatch. Everywhere the ghost appears, she then goes. So it was an interesting conscious decision. It's like the ghost is sitting here, suddenly she sits there. Is that part of her psychosis too? It's just like, as far as like knowing what the ghosts look like, we don't really see like visually what the ghosts look like until she sees what the people look like. So it's
mhm,
like it kind of plays out if it was in her head, like she didn't really see a face until she got confirmation of what the people actually look like. So there were a couple of interesting decisions as far as the film goes, not the book, is
mhm.
like how they played out. Is it real or is it not real? And
Yeah.
also listen to the commentary on it as well. And that's kind of like how they wanted to play it, is that it played both ways, as if what it was real and if it wasn't real. But for me, if it is real, it's not as interesting because there's
Right.
nothing to dissect. There's nothing to psychoanalyze. If it's not real, that's where it really gets interesting because it's like what's going on in this woman's head, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
And is she this unreliable narrator type thing, which
Hmm.
is a popular phrase right now with like films like The Joker and things like that, where you have this main character telling the story, but can we really trust, what's going on in that character's head? So, yeah, I think for modern audiences, they would love that aspect of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think it is a very well made movie, very well acted, and it is scary, it is creepy, and it is probably one of the groundbreaking films in terms of creepy kids, as you were talking about. Um, I think that's something that a lot of horror films seem to want to dwell on, which is children, and either the threat to the children or the children being a threat. There's kind of two different sides to that coin, but it seems to be one of the most popular subjects for horror films in modern times. Children that are somehow at the center of it. And as a friend of mine once said, he thinks it's because people who are parents, I guess, that's the most horrifying thing they can imagine, is that their children are either threatened or hurt or killed, or maybe their children are bad or evil, or something like that. I don't have kids. I don't have that same kind of instinct or whatever, maybe, but this is definitely a movie that I think is at the beginnings of that kind of children at the center of the horror film thing.
Mhm. I think what also helps, I mean, two things help these children be super creepy. Truman Capote's writing is number one by far.
Hmm.
And the second thing is they don't act creepy. I think modern filmmakers and modern films, they try to make the kids act creepy. It's like kids don't act like that. It's like, or they try to make the kids act like adults. It's like, no, it's a kid. Have you ever been around a kid? Kids are idiots. They're kids, they're learning. And they try to make the kids be too smart or too mature or act creepy. A fucking kid is creepy no matter what they do. It's like they don't have to act creepy. They just have to be a kid and they're being creepy. They say inappropriate things, they act inappropriately because they don't know any better. And that can be creepy in and of itself. And I think
Yeah.
that one, it's the writing, and two, it's the fact that they don't try to make the kids act creepy. She's acting weird, and they're like saying, "What are you talking about? Like, we're just kids playing." And she's like, "Oh my God, the children!" Like, she's the one freaking out, because they're not acknowledging her craziness. They're just
Hmm.
acting like normal kids playing around. And that's where the creepiness come from. It comes from the contrast of what's going on screen. It doesn't come from the kids acting like aliens or zombies or adults. They're acting like kids. She's acting freak out. And it's just like, whoa, like what's really going on with like these two different reactions to things going on. And it's what's crazy is like when you get wrapped up in the story, you're kind of enthralled in like how it's going to play out. But if you really look at it from the kid's point of view, she's fucking crazy. It's like they didn't do anything wrong. The only thing that happened is a little boy without a parent, without any of his parents, without a male father figure, act like a freaked out and weirded a bunch of people out in school. Like how many boys his age wouldn't do that? And he gets expelled. That's it. Like, is that he's rich, he's spoiled, he has no father figure, no parents, and he acted out and he got expelled. That sounds fucking normal. That doesn't sound like anything so weird. That's the basis of her losing her fucking mind. Deborah Kerr, what's wrong with no? It must be a ghost because why did you get expelled? And she's like shaking him like a rag doll. Like, why did you? That's all. With all the drama in the film, that's the only thing that's the major thing that happened in the story. Nothing really happens in the movie. Like as suspenseful, as interesting, as mysterious as it is, what really happens? No one gets killed. No, well, no spoiler at the end, but as far as like the as far as the body of the movie, no one's getting killed, no one's threatening to be killed, no one's really in any real danger, there's no real violence, there's no real killer, there's really nothing going on aside from the sexual repression. To me, the other interesting aspect of it is religion. It reminds me of like these people, again, part of it's a sexual repression, but to me that's a part, that's not the full scope. The full scope is growing up in a religious household where you can't do this and you can't do that, and it's like if you do this you're wrong and you need to be saved, and I'm the one that's going to save you. And I think that's how kind of her character is. She probably grew up in this house with a religious father. Doing this is wrong, doing that is wrong. And obviously, doing all these things is wrong. And she's not married, she hasn't had sex. And let's say she is Deborah Kerr's age, she's in her 40s. Here's this woman in her 40s, never been with a man, never did anything wrong, views any little thing as going against God. And she's here to save you. I'm here to save you. I'm here to save you, even if it's gonna like, even if I have to kill you to do it, you know?
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that religious aspect of it, where she's not just like, you're doing something wrong and you need to be saved, but I'm the one that's going to save you. That hubris. You're not just going to be saved, but I'm going to be the one that's going to correct this situation. To steal a line from a movie we're going to talk about later, the boy needed to be corrected. So, so she's going to correct him. It's just
Yeah.
like that to me, like those aspects of it is what makes it a great movie for me, because like people like that, or you can visualize people like that, or you can see people like that in the media, or people like that, or famous religious nuts like that, where it's just like, I'm like this religious savior. And even like someone like myself, I'm from Guyana, and one of the big things that people know about Guyana is Jim Jones. And even if they don't know Jim Jones, they know the term drinking the Kool-Aid. And he was
Hmm.
like a religious nut. Did a mass suicide cult thing in Guyana.
Hmm.
So with people drinking the poison Kool-Aid and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm very familiar with those religious cult type leaders, and again, that's how that Deborah Kerr character comes off, where it's just like she's just this freaky, repressed religious woman that's just there to like save these kids from what, her imagination, because that's the only thing we actually see. So
Yeah. Well, definitely a good movie, definitely a scary movie, and definitely deserves to be on this list.
And again, this is what we've mentioned several times. We mentioned this the way the Cat and the Canary mentions why that's the title. This isn't the best. This is the essential. But if this were the best, this would be top three at least for me, minimum. This is one of my favorite films in the genre and on this list. It's
Yeah,
really, really good watch.
yeah, for sure. The Haunting, 1963. Now, this, interestingly enough, this is another movie that I saw for the first time in a midnight screening at the Art House Theater many, many years ago. Series of ghost stories. Um, Saw this with a few friends, and I think it fared a little better than the other one on first viewing. I think we did find it sort of scary and suspenseful, but we also found it a little bit campy and over the top, I think, particularly with the lesbian subtexts,
A little
which,
campy and over the top. A little.
yes, which of
This
course is
this is
not,
almost like a comedy. I mean,
oh, yeah,
unintentional or not, it's
yeah,
I view this
it's,
as a comedy, a horror
yeah.
comedy.
Well, it's the so-called lesbian subtext is not very far below the text. It's very, very clear and obvious. But maybe, maybe audiences in 1963 would have been a little less in tune to that. I don't know. But regardless, I love this movie, and I love it for both reasons. Because it is scary, but it's also kind of campy and over the top and funny.
So, do you consider it subtext because they don't actually use the word lesbian? Because like,
yes,
where's the subtlety in the
yes.
subtext? You know?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's subtext, but it's not very sub. It's pretty
Yeah.
much there. But yes, because they never actually come out and say it, they come really close. There are moments where, the character says something like, "You are a mistake of nature," or something like that. And I guess that is very much something that someone might say, perhaps a religious character from a
As a
previous movie,
callback, yes.
might say that.
Look at you
So
tying things in together like a writer you
yeah,
are.
oh yeah. So anyway, I think the opening sequence of this movie is brilliant. I think it's stylish, it's exciting. I love the way they sort of give you the whole history of Hill House, and they sort of show you these little snippets of things and how people died in the house, and they say things like it was an evil home from the beginning, a house that was born bad. I just love that. I think it's I almost feel like I have my money's worth by the time we get to the end of that opening sequence. I'm so entertained by that.
Mhm.
I think this is also a very influential movie because I think it could be one of the first movies to actually focus kind of on ghost hunters or experts, psychics, people going into a supposedly haunted house and trying to get to the bottom of it, trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, he
Um,
almost like builds his team. It's almost like an
yes,
Ocean's 11. I need my team. You
that's
know what I'm
right.
saying?
That's right. Dr. John Markway, he assembles this team, uh, and he's specifically looking for people who've had supernatural experiences before, and he thinks that that's somehow going to maybe make them more in tune to Hill House and what's going on there. But he winds up only getting two people who agree to come with him: Theodora, who's a psychic, and Eleanor Lance, played by Julie Harris, who apparently experienced poltergeist activity as a child, although she denies it when he tries to ask her about it. She says that didn't happen. And aside from those two sort of experts, he's forced to take the nephew of the owner of the house as kind of a security thing. I guess she wants somebody there to kind of keep an eye on things, and he's kind of an obnoxious character who's a total skeptic. He doesn't believe in anything. Played by Russ Tamblyn. Um, so what's interesting about the movie, I think, and what makes it work really well is that almost nothing is shown. It's mainly sounds, it's the sound design, it's the atmosphere. It's the performances. This kind of makes it scarier that we don't actually see much of anything, because it kind of operates on the level of terror as opposed to horror. And this is something that Stephen King talked about as well, where he said the highest form of horror is terror. And that's like when you know that there's something on the other side of the door, but you don't know what it is. You hear the sounds, you see the doorknob moving, something's out there, but we don't know what it is. And as soon as the door opens, even if it's a giant monster, we feel a certain amount of relief because we now know what it is and we know what we're dealing with. And, the way he put it is it could be a 10-foot tall monster, but you could go, oh, thank God. I was afraid it would be a 100-foot tall monster. There's always some form of relief. But I think this movie does operate on that level of terror where we don't know what's going on, and we hear things, and we do see the doorknob moving, and it's very effective.
Yeah.
And I think that also it's a very psychological movie, kind of like the last one. It's another movie where it's like, is it real or is it in her head? What's going on here? The character of Eleanor, she's a very troubled character.
Mm-hmm.
And is she our hero? Is she our main character? I mean, the movie starts out kind of with the doctor, but then we kind of switch to her and we see her home life, and she's got this
It's
really
very
sad.
interesting the way they switch between those characters,
Yeah.
because it does one of the cardinal sins in movies. It has two people doing narration.
Yes.
So it starts off with the narration of the doctor, the main, who you think is, oh, that's going to be our main character because he's narrating the film. Then suddenly
Yes.
she's narrating the film.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and you're right, it's very similar to the previous film in that what makes this movie interesting is the psychological state of our lead character.
Yes.
And while the previous film deals with it in with drama and suspense, to me this really works with the humor. It's just so silly. It's just so over
Yeah.
the top. And she's just so pathetic in the most wonderful way. She's such a loser. But you love her. It's just like
Yes.
her
Yes.
desperation, her wanting for like companionship and to be wanted and to belong somewhere. It's just
Yes.
so desperate and sad and
Yes.
funny at the same time. It's oh my God. I
Yeah.
laughed out loud. I've seen this movie like maybe 4 times, and every time I see it, I laugh out loud. It's very
Yeah.
rare movies where I know what's coming and it's still funny to me, and most of them are just flat out comedies. But
Yeah.
this to me is just it's so hilarious. And again, I don't know if it's intentionally hilarious or not intentionally hilarious, but I think it's non-intentionally funny. But the thing about most movies that are funny non-intentionally is because they're so bad, like The Room, movies like
Hmm.
that we've done before, where it's just like, man, it's so bad, it's funny, and that's the non-intentional aspect of it. But for me, it's good filmmaking, but
Hmm.
it's still funny, and I don't think it's trying to be funny. So it's I don't know what to think of it in a way. I know it belongs on this list, but I don't know where on this list it belongs because like I'm fascinated by how weird it is because you have the guy at the gate who's the old guy that warns you that we see in a million horror movies. Oh, miss, you don't want to come into this house.
Hmm.
And he's like denying her and won't let her in, and she has to talk her way in. And then when the doctor's wife comes, she's like, yeah, I just slipped him 20 bucks. It's like, is that meant to
Yeah.
be a joke? Because it's fucking hilarious. Because like,
Yeah.
it's just stuff like that happens. And just like American Psycho, which is another horror movie that I guess it's horror, but it's one of
Yeah.
those psychological movies that was intended to be funny, where it's like the lead character is just so obsessed with little things. With just like with this lead character here, she's like, she makes up that story about like, oh yes, I live in this wonderful one bedroom apartment, and she's
Yeah.
describing it, and obviously she's lying, and then she just has that breakdown when like they want to kick her out the house. Just like the little things she obsesses on is just so hilarious. They let you know off the top what her situation is, and then her facade then comes on, and we know it's a facade. It takes us on that journey. the previous one we mentioned with the innocence, there's a mystery because we don't know Deborah Kerr's past or like what's going on or if it's real or it's not real. We know everything she's saying is a lie because we know what her situation is. So seeing her lie,
Yeah,
it's cringy in a way, but it's just like you can't look away. It's like one of those accidents where you can't look away. I don't
yeah,
know. This film is so entertaining to me. It's just
yeah.
so entertaining. But again, I don't think it's bad filmmaking. I don't think it's an intentional comedy. But
No.
God, it was funny. It
Yeah.
was funny.
Yeah, I agree. I think that probably some of the humor is intentional. I think, Russ Tamblin's character, I think, is deliberately being a bit of a comedic character. But
But I didn't
so,
find. But yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. But like, I didn't find his stuff funny though. I mean, I didn't find it not funny. But the humor I'm talking about isn't coming from his character. It's coming from the lead
right.
character.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, I think some of it has to be intentional. I think some of it probably isn't. It's probably the way it's aged. But it's funny that it does work, though, still as a kind of a serious horror film. And I think Stephen King must have been influenced by this in a way because his story of Carrie is about a girl who has telekinetic abilities, and there's a story in there about when she was young. There was an incident where a bunch of rocks or stones rained down upon the house inexplicably, and I think the implication is that she was doing it with her telekinetic power, and she probably didn't even know she was doing it. She was like a child. And there's a similar story in here about what happened to Eleanor in the past, and it's something to do with stones falling, and she kind of denies it. No, that was all, that didn't happen, which just makes me think it did happen. And I think that her character, this is where it's a little bit unclear in terms of, is there a haunting here? Or is it her character who has some kind of telekinetic abilities, who's kind of, I mean, she's got her own delusions, but she's affecting things that the other characters are actually seeing. They're seeing the doorknob move. Is that happening, or is that her somehow with her mind controlling that? And I don't think the movie gives us a clear answer on that. And apparently they did talk to this is based on a book by Shirley Jackson, and they apparently spoke to her about it, and they said, we're kind of thinking that maybe this is what's going on, that maybe the character is somehow affecting this, and that there isn't really a haunting. Is that what you intended? And Shirley Jackson said no, but that's a good idea. So that's not what the novel was about. It may be what the movie's about. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they kind of leave it ambiguous in terms of what happens. Is it all coming from her somehow, or is she augmenting it? Is there some supernatural activity and she's somehow making it worse by being there?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. She's a very intriguing character.
Yeah, you're right. There are certain aspects of it. Again, to me, the comedy is what really stands out. But there are certain aspects of it that are fascinating. Like you said, this isn't something that she's the only one seeing. So it implies that it is happening. And
Yes.
it doesn't seem like anyone else is bringing anything to the table from a supernatural standpoint. It's more just like a psychological standpoint. So if it's coming from anyone, it would be her. Because a lot of the times it's happening to her or around her. Yeah, you could see like if it's really something supernatural, is it coming from her or the house or a combination of both? Also, the aspect of they brought out the fact that like she did resent her mother, and it is questioned like, yeah, we don't blame you for killing your mother, and that kind of freaks her out. Like, wait a minute, did she kill her mother?
Yeah.
And there is one genuinely freaky part that in this movie that, all joking aside, I thought was just brilliant horror, where she's like, "You're hurting my hand. Stop squeezing my hand." And then they show that wide shot, and the other girl's all the way across the room. I was like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, that was well done." I just assumed she was there. So that as much as I joke, there are aspects of this movie that's brilliant. which is why I say, unlike The Room, even though you're laughing at certain points, it is good filmmaking. This
Yes.
is, you're watching a good movie. The humor's there, so you kind of like, I don't know, you're right. Maybe it didn't age, certain aspects of it didn't age well, but it was good filmmaking behind it.
Yes. And I mentioned the director, Robert Wise. He came from the background of working with Val Lewton, who made a lot of these horror films like I Walked with a Zombie and Cat People. And they're very much horror films that are about more implied scares and suspense. They're not about overt monsters or special effects. They're more about the atmosphere and the unknown, the things that you don't see. And so I think Robert Wise, coming from that background, is kind of using that technique here very effectively, where he's keeping it all very mysterious. We don't really see a ghost in this movie. We hear things, we see things we can't explain, but it's not an overt monster movie or an overt ghost movie in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a great movie, and I think it probably influenced a lot of other movies that came after it that even went further into the let's bring in some experts and try and figure out what's going on in this haunted house.
Yeah. And also, before we wrap on this movie, shout out to Russ Tamblyn from West Side Story, this movie, and of course, one of my favorites. I don't know if we can ever work this into a list. Satan Sadist.
Oh, that is one of my favorites as well. I, I love that movie.
Real schlocky film by a schlocky filmmaker.
Oh yes,
Surprising to see an actor like Russ Tamblyn in there, but I guess he had hard
yes,
times.
yes, yeah. Well, you know, we could either do a biker list or we could do an Al Adamson deep dive. uh, but that's for another day.
I think we talked earlier about not watching trailers and just watching a poster. And the poster for this movie is the only thing I saw going into it. And the only thing I know about this movie is I've heard it's this really abstract, weird, artsy horror movie. And I saw the poster. So I was expecting like a dark, weird Japanese horror movie. And I had no idea it was about a bunch of teenage girls. I'm like, what the F am I watching? Like, where are these teenage girls? Is this movie just like some teeny bopper, like CW? You know, what the hell am I watching? And
It is a weird movie though. You got that part right. It is
yes,
weird.
it is weird, but I was caught off guard because I didn't see, I saw zero footage of this movie. I think maybe I saw a few seconds of the piano playing scene, but I didn't really see much footage, much stills. I just heard about this movie for years, and I just saw the image of the poster. I didn't see like movie stills, I didn't see footage. I just heard. So I was really caught off guard when I saw this movie, and I realized it was just about a bunch of young girls. And then when I saw the nudity in the movie, I was like, dear God, I hope these girls are older than the age they're playing, because there's a decent amount of nudity from these girls who I assumed were like 15 or 16 when the movie started, as far as like the runtime, not like when they started shooting. But
Yeah.
yeah, I was shocked at what I actually saw. The visuals are really interesting. And one of the reasons I wanted it on this list is I think when you do a list like this, you should try to encompass like all aspects of it, not just blockbusters, not just cult films, not just creepy films, not just intellectual films, but you also have to include like art house as well. And I wanted to include this because it is an art house film, it is a cult film, it is a film that is talked about in, you know, in like underground circles of filmmakers and film fans. It actually was financially successful as well. Usually cult films usually aren't successful. They're called cult films because they're a movie that is lost, except for like a bunch of people who just talk about it and keep it going in like a small little circle. It was financially successful as well. Very weird movie. It does live up to that billing. Not sure if it's the type of movie for me, because again, I didn't. This wasn't what we talk about expectations. This wasn't what I was necessarily expecting. I thought some of the ideas were good. For me, a lot of the interesting visuals and interesting storytelling kind of happened in the first act, and then subsequently, it just seemed like a lot of like dated special effects. lazy characterizations. I did see a lot of behind the scenes footage of this movie just because it was just so odd to me and I didn't know what to take of it. The filmmaker was talking about how he was inspired by like Akira Kurosawa. That's why he wanted to have seven women because of seven samurai and seven's a good number. But I mean, when you talk about Kurosawa, you're talking about a guy who's great with characterization and it's like one girl's named Kung Fu because she knows Kung Fu and she's flying around with like wires, and this other girl is Mac because she eats a lot. She's her stomach and Melody because she plays music and on and on and on. It's just like I don't know. It's just it's not for me. And I said the visuals were interesting, but
Yeah.
most of the really interesting visuals came very early on, and then for me after that it was just kind of a slog getting through the
Yeah.
rest of the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I had a very similar experience. This is a movie that I heard a lot about. You know, it has a big cult following. A lot of people love this movie. Put out by Criterion, you know, so you think, okay, this is a movie that is worthy of that kind of attention. And I had seen it many years ago, but I couldn't really remember it. You know, one of those things. I just had no memory of it. But I think it is very surreal. It's kind of silly. It's comical in tone more than it is scary, I think. It's weird, it's wacky. I mean, one example of the sort of horror action in this movie is that a severed head bites one of the girls on the ass, you know, and that's sort of one of the moments. A severed head bites her on the ass. Like, it's not scary, right? It's silly. It's just kind of campy. It's silly. Now, having said that, it is very interesting to look at. It is very visual. You know, it's definitely got something going on. But I don't see it as a very scary movie. I don't see it as a horror film, really. The music is kind of pleasant and upbeat. It's not really scary music. Um, and I don't know. I just thought that, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's not really for me. I think there's a reason I couldn't remember it very well. Its reputation, its reputation is very good, but yeah, I just saw it as kind of a very strange movie.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely think it belongs in the essential list even after seeing it because when you're talking about an essential list, you're talking about like what are the most important movies I should watch in this genre. And I think this is an important movie to watch because of its reputation.
Mm.
Even if you don't like something, you have to know why. Knowing why you don't like something is just as important as knowing why you like something. So, knowing why you like certain aspects of filmmaking is just as important to know why certain aspects of filmmaking don't work, you know? And also, it's good to see a movie that's independently made get a cult following. Cheaply
Hmm.
made get a cult following. And again, we talk about cheaply made movies. We have a cheaply made movie coming up later that I also don't like that, also made a lot of money. But again, I still feel good about having this on this list as opposed to a movie that I like a lot better that was also made cheaply, House on Haunted Hill, because House on Haunted Hill was made to be schlock. There wasn't a lot of effort. It was like, hey, get this done in a week or however long it took to get it done and just put it out there and let's just have a bunch of gimmicks. This movie was made with a lot of heart. It took
Hmm.
years to make. This was a guy who loved film. He was passionate about it. The backstory of this movie is interesting with how long it took to get done, how he had to get it sold. He started in commercials. It was a Japanese made film. It's like there weren't a lot of Japanese filmmakers making films in Japan. It didn't get a lot of press despite the lack of press and lack of promotion, the movie went on to be a huge hit, has a huge following. So I definitely think it's important to watch if you're going to be, you know, diving into these films. Yes, you can watch another low budget movie film that's probably better, like as far as like entertainment wise, like House on Haunted Hill. Yes, you can watch another haunted house movie that's way better done, like the others that didn't make this list. But again, you can see a bunch of movies. I can name 10 other really good movies like the others off the top of my head, but there's nothing essential about it. There's nothing
Hmm.
like after I watch this movie, I'm never going to look at movies the same way again, or this movie is like passionately made, or this movie is followed by religiously by a certain subsect of people. This movie is important to people of a certain generation because it showed them you can do these different experimental things and still be successful. It doesn't mean you have to be subjugated to just like art house. You can do these weird, odd things that no one else is doing and still be a profitable movie and still have passionate followers. So for those aspects, I definitely think it was worth being on this list. I still think it's worth being on this list. But from an entertainment standpoint, as far as like me like connecting with this movie, I don't really feel like I connected with it, and I wasn't necessarily entertained by it.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think just having a Japanese horror film is important because that is a thing. There are Japanese horror films, and some of them are quite good. Some of them are quite scary. Um, and there's also horror films from all over the world, so it's good to include something that comes from a very different culture from ours. And I think that there probably are things that we just don't get, because we're not from that culture. We don't really understand
And
everything
that
that's
time when it was
going on
made
there.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely, and it is a very unique film. Like I think for that reason alone, it's worth watching because it's not really like anything else.
Yeah.
It's certainly not like any other film on this list. So yeah, I think it's worth checking out. And ultimately, it's probably not going to be added to my personal collection, but you know, I'm not sorry to have seen it, and even haven't seen it a second time, in fact. So yeah, a movie that is actually one of my personal favorites. It's called The Amityville Horror from 1979, directed by Stuart Rosenberg. Now, this movie, I know there are people out there who don't really like this movie, who don't think it's a great movie. And in fact, I know there are some people who think that Amityville Part 2 is a better movie than The Amityville Horror. I personally don't agree with that, but the Amityville Horror, I think, whether you love it or you don't, it is one of the most famous haunting cases of all time. It's supposedly based on a true story of George and Catherine Lutz, and they wrote a book about it with Jay Anson, which became this huge bestseller, just sold millions of copies. And then they decided to make this movie, and the movie was such a massive hit. It was apparently the biggest independent film for many years, up until I think the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles overtook it. So it made a ton of money, and it launched a whole series of movies, including at least two very direct sequels, and then a whole bunch of other movies that are maybe not even quite related, but they're part of the Amityville universe. And they also did a remake, and there are also a huge number of books about this case, that people have written, sort of taking a look at it. And this is, of course, one of the cases, and it's probably the case that made them famous. This is Ed and Lorraine Warren, who we've mentioned before, and we're going to talk about again. They investigated the Amityville haunting, and they declared it to be an authentic haunting back in the 70s. So for whatever that's worth, it was, I think everybody's heard of this. I think everybody's heard of the Amityville Horror. It's just such a cultural phenomenon. It's just, I think this movie, if for no other reason than that, needs to be on this list. But I personally love it. I saw this movie when I was a kid. I was probably about 10 years old, and saw it on TV, and it scared the crap out of me. I remember lying in bed later that night and in the darkness, and I was afraid to open my eyes, because there's a scene in the movie where Margot Kidder looks out the window and she sees these two eyes shining in the darkness, and I just was afraid I was going to see eyes shining in the darkness if I opened my eyes and looked. So anyway, from a personal point of view, I found this movie to be very, very scary and very effective as a kid, and I watched it every chance I got over the years. Um, but this movie, is also, I think, very influential, or at least it contains a lot of the things that we're going to see over and over again. One of the things that I think we will see in other movies, and we see here very clearly, is that one of the parents, in this case the father, kind of becomes possessed by the evil, and he kind of becomes a threat to his family. That's kind of the overarching story here, because it's based on there were a series of murders that took place in this house in 1974. This is a true story. The convicted killer Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his whole family in 1974, and so George and Catherine Lutz, they bought this house, and nobody really wanted it because these murders had taken place there, and they got it cheap. And then they supposedly experienced all these supernatural things, and wound up having to leave the house. And I think part of the implication is that the evil of the house possessed Ronald DeFeo Jr. and made him kill his family. And the same thing is starting to happen in this movie to James Brolin, who stars as George Lutz, and Margot Kidder stars as Catherine, his wife. And
Margot Kidder's second time on the show.
Yes, absolutely. Margot Kidder, she's in a lot of movies I really like for some reason. But it's got that storyline of one of the parents, and it's most often the father, who seems to be going a little crazy or seems to be getting possessed by the evil. I don't know. I think it's just a movie that I love. It contains the dog who knows something is wrong. We see the dog scratching away at the wall in the basement. And it's also the hidden room, or the hidden place in the basement, because they break through the wall and discover a room that's been kind of hidden there.
The red room.
The red room, yes. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about it. I just find it extremely compelling. I can watch it anytime. I enjoy it. Rod Steiger plays a priest who, tries to come to the house to bless the house, but he is overtaken by the evil and chased out of the house. And apparently, in terms of the true story aspect of it, the real life priest has said at different points that, yeah, he did hear a voice in the house and it told him to get out. So, as kooky as it may be, there is some amount of evidence that this could be a real haunting. Although I think a lot of people have tried to expose it and say it's not a real haunting. As you were saying about Ed and Lorraine Warren, it's questionable. They say it was real, but the good news is they're not in this movie. So it's strictly about the family, and it's from the
Did
point
you
of
see
view
what I did there when I said thank God? their religious background.
Yeah, perfect.
What's interesting about this movie is that, so I did look into a lot of the behind the scenes stuff with this. So since you've seen this movie a lot, maybe you can remind me. I don't remember them mentioning the Indian burial ground in the movie, which is weird because that would go on to be a trope in these movies.
Yeah.
And that was part of the real story.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was part of the movie at all.
Well, they do mention it. It's
okay.
It's not really something they dwell on a lot, but they do mention it, particularly when they're in the basement and they do sort of get into that room.
Mm-hmm.
There is some mention of this being an old Indian burial ground, and they say something about also the crazy people were brought here and left to die. It might be a separate incident. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. So as far as the actual story goes, Indian burial ground, I guess some chief was killed there, and then some kid dug up the grave and used his head as a football or like a soccer ball or something, and that pissed off the chief, and that's when he started haunting the ground, not the house. So the house was not the issue, it was the sacred ground. that was
Yes.
desecrated by that kid. And then he's the whole get out thing was him saying to get off the property, get away
Yes.
from here, not to get out the house. But they just
Yes.
kept, they built a house on the property was the issue. They didn't make this movie saying, hey, we should go with one of the big tropes in these movies is, trope became a trope over time. But it's just
Yes.
kind of funny, even if they didn't mention it, they didn't make that seem to be the genesis of what's going on. So I didn't see the remake, but for instance, the remake or if an original movie was made on this story now, I could see that being a big part of it. Well, what led to the haunting, and let's do the research. That would be a big part of like how the movie would unfold. But that didn't seem
Yeah.
to be a big part of the story that was told on screen, at least. It
No.
is that aspect of it.
No, it's not. And in a way, I think that's good because I don't know whether the whole Indian burial ground thing is considered to be cool anymore for people to be making movies about that.
Well,
And,
this wasn't. This is. We're not talking about a movie made now, but back then.
no,
But
no,
yeah, but you're saying if
no.
they remade it now, you're saying
Well, I'm saying maybe it's good that they didn't dwell on it because
it
maybe if they
wouldn't have aged
did,
as well.
yeah, maybe that's what I'm saying.
Mhm.
And I mean, this movie, like, you can view it as a little bit of that. Is it real, or is it in their heads? Because it's a family that moves in, and they start to disintegrate. They start to have all these problems, and some of them are kind of realistic problems. Money
Mhm.
goes missing. Where did the money go? They're having problems.
Mhm.
Um, they think that the house is in some way haunted, and they move out. They get out. But because we don't have the experts coming in and saying, oh, yes, this is definitely a haunting, I think it works better because we don't know 100% for sure how much of it is real and how much of it is just their experience of it. Or are they, in fact, lying? And is this just a story they're telling to try and have a best selling book? We don't know. But to me, it works because it is really just about them, and I find them to be relatively sympathetic, being in this situation and
Mhm.
bad things are happening and they're looking for an explanation. Like, oh, well, maybe there is some evil force here that's messing with us.
Yeah, there's certain aspects of the movie I didn't really quite get. Why does the husband go crazy? We've
Yeah,
seen that trope before, but there's usually an explanation. He
yeah.
just wakes up one morning and says, "I'm crazy." It's just like, wait, what did I miss? Like what
Well,
drove
I
you over
think
the
it's,
top? The only connection they show is that he looked almost exactly like the guy that killed the family, which again has nothing to
yes,
do with the true story. And
yeah.
also, what's interesting too is Jamie Brolin had a brother, and
Hmm.
his brother was actually the one that played, or at least in the photo of
Yeah,
the previous killer. I thought it was
yeah.
just just Brolin himself, but it's his brother,
No, yeah,
evidently.
yeah. Um, well, I think it's supposed to be the evil possessing him, and it's supposed to be the idea that the evil possessed the other guy and caused him to do this, and now it's possessing him. And I think the
But it would have
idea
been
that
nice if they visually showed us something.
mhm, yeah,
He's just chopping wood. I'm crazy. I'm
yeah.
chopping wood.
Well,
Well, show us something that happened.
yeah. Well, I think there is a descent. I mean, I think he starts out very reasonable, and then he gets more and more crazy, and he looks worse and worse. And I think maybe the implication is that they look alike because they're kind of letting themselves go. They're letting the beard and the hair kind of get really long,
Mhm.
kind of like me. So I'm possessed by the evil now as well. But maybe that's what it is there. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think they're suggesting it's
Is your
it's kind
house built on an Indian burial ground too?
of not that I know of. I don't think so. I don't
Okay.
think so. It's a big apartment block, so who knows? But no, I don't think so.
So the Warrens thinks it's haunted, and there was also a parapsychologist who actually thinks it's haunted, but they clash. I guess there's a lot of tension between the parapsychologist and the Warrens. That's like a big backstory. I think that would make an interesting movie, like how much
Hmm.
they dislike each other, and but they both kind of agree in terms of something's going on there, type
Yeah.
situation. The backstory is kind of interesting. This movie doesn't click for me as much as it clicks for you because there's no like emotional connection to when it came out. And also, like, I think the execution isn't great, but I was more entertained than I thought I would be. Like, I came into this thinking, like it deserves to be on this list because it made a lot of money, it cost very little, and it spawned all these sequels. So it definitely belonged on this list without question. I didn't think I would like it. There are the elements that I don't like about it. I knew I wouldn't like about it going into it because I've seen it before a long time ago. One is that the ending didn't really do anything for me. They weren't really building to anything. They didn't really know how to end it. So the ending didn't work. The way he turned crazy, like it just it didn't the execution wasn't there for me. So I knew I wouldn't like those elements going into it. So I wasn't disappointed in those elements when I watched it again. Those were only two things that I didn't like. Aside from that, I thought it was pretty good. I thought
Hmm.
adding Rod Steiger in there is something that was a brilliant move. With these horror movies, you have like these cookie cutter, good looking, B level type female lead actor and actress. And then you really try to get the prestige or the really good acting scenes with like some character actor who's not really quite a good lead because he doesn't have the looks for a lead or he's too old to be a lead. And that's where you get like the really good acting scenes, like the Bela Lugosi's and Boris Karloffs and stuff like that. Rod Steiger kind of added to that in that I think he's a great actor, one of those like original method actors. And I thought his scenes were really good as far as like the way they were executed with the horror aspects of it and also with his performance. So I thought his scenes really elevated the film a lot. James Brolin, not the biggest fan. He hasn't come in a lot of movies that were great. I'm a bigger fan of his son, more so than I am of his. But I thought he was really good, and it's probably one of his better performances. And then you also have Margot Kidder. Not the biggest fan of hers, but she looked great physically. I mean, this is
Hmm.
probably as hot as I've ever seen her look. She's come in a few movies I've liked, Superman, and she came in another like horror movie where she had like a twin sister.
Yeah, sisters. Yeah.
Yeah, sisters. Yeah. So she's come in a few movies I've liked. This is probably right up there with I think her better performances and her better movies.
Hmm.
So overall, like I really did like this movie. Like I said, just those two elements that I knew I wouldn't like going into it. But aside from that, it's pretty good.
Hmm. Yeah, and for me, of course, because I have the nostalgia from when I was a kid, I love it, and I can watch it anytime. So for me, it's definitely a classic. But I think it's regardless, it's a movie that people should see if they're
Mhm.
interested in haunted house movies. It's definitely one of the most famous and probably one of the most influential.
The other aspect that I thought was weird that didn't really bother me initially when I saw it, but actually did kind of bother me this time. It's like they did very little developing those kids. It's like you can
Hmm.
almost forget like not just the names of the kids, but even how many kids are in the house. It's like you have like the whole movie. It's like they could have picked like maybe one or two scenes to like establish the kids on some kind of level. I mean, I did think it was interesting because I think in real life they were the parents of both of their kids. As far as what I know, I didn't do like
Yeah.
extensive research with the kids stuff. They were the mother and father of the kids. The movie portrays it as he's not the father. On the rewatch, like I didn't really remember a lot of the movie into the rewatch, so I thought that would have been a bigger part of it on this
Hmm.
rewatch. I was like, oh, they're not his kids, so like that's part of what's gonna go into his psychosis. It's like, man, I got to deal with this fucking bitch and her goddamn kids that aren't even mine. It's like I thought that would
Yeah.
play into it, but it didn't.
Yeah.
It's like why even mention that they're not his kids? A, because I don't think that's part of the real story, and B, they didn't really use it at all. Like I thought that would be for me. Like I don't have kids. Like I can imagine falling in love with a woman and like she has these kids. It's like, man, I don't have kids. I don't even know if I particularly want kids. And I'm at the point in my life where it's like it's now or never. And like now I'm
Hmm.
stuck with these fucking brats that are running around this goddamn house that I can't even fucking afford. My business is going to shit. These kids won't shut the fuck up. And like I could see like aspects of that that can help in the character development, like with him going over the edge and her being torn, where it's like she loves him, but she loves her kids. Don't make me choose. It's like there's so many elements of that that could be developed for like more drama and lead to him like just like losing it. But I felt they kind of dropped the ball on that.
Well, I think it's there a little bit, but yeah, they maybe could have gone further into that. Although the movie is 2 hours long, so maybe
Mhm.
they were just thinking it's too long. But speaking of creepy kids, though, I think the daughter is very creepy in a couple of scenes in this
Mhm.
movie.
Yeah.
So, and also there's a trope here that we will see again, I think, which is the little girl or the child who seems to be communicating with somebody who isn't there, a
Yeah, we
ghost.
see that a lot after
Yeah,
this. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, there was speaking of the kid, there was the really one really creepy scene where the babysitter's stuck in the closet. And
yes.
then, James comes home, he's like, what do you mean you're stuck in the closet? There's no fucking lock on the door. It's like that was an
Yes,
interesting that was an interesting twist. I was like, that's
yeah,
you did
yeah,
pretty good there,
yeah,
movie. That's
yeah.
good
Oh, yeah.
movie. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, and I mean that's a scene that horrified me when I was 10 years old too. I just
Yeah.
found that very, very scary. Yeah,
Yeah, I didn't see that coming at all. The
yeah,
fact that he would show that was pretty well executed. There are
yeah,
some really good moments, and like I said, overall it is a very good movie. Just a few faults in there, but every movie has its flaws, and this
yeah.
is definitely not just the movie itself, but again, its legacy of the sequels, the remake, the fact that it made so much money, the fact that it cost so little money, the whole true story thing, the Warrens aspect of it, the feuding with the parapsychologists, the whole backstory. There's a lot of good. The fact that Amityville is a real place, it's a real house. The town is this only thing the town is known for. There's a lot there that really warrants this movie. Get it? Warren
Yeah,
warrants.
yeah. I
Let's see
heard
what I'm
that
looking.
actually. I heard that.
This
I heard
movie
that.
being on this list. So,
Very clever.
I try. I try.
Yeah,
I'm not writing stories for TV shows, but I do what I
yeah.
can.
You could. You could.
Uh,
Yeah.
Next on this list is maybe my favorite movie of all time. Forget
Mm.
horror movies, forget haunted house movies, forget any kind of criteria you can put on a movie. This may be my favorite movie of all time. And I tell you, when it comes to some of these scenes that come up in this movie, I just get a smile from ear to ear when I know certain scenes are coming up. When I see Wendy go up to Jack Torrance as he's on that typewriter, I just start laughing and giggling because I know this dialogue and this performance is coming. And it's just, oh my God, this is such a classic. It's just so funny. It's so entertaining. It's so deep. If you just Google The Shining on YouTube, you're going to see all of these reviews. And it's not just reviews of like us, which is some couple dudes talking about movies. It's about people analytically breaking it down from, scholars breaking this movie down, talking about characters and scenes for like a 20-minute video could just be about one scene or one character. Like this movie's been so analyzed. It's just unbelievable. It's entertaining, it's funny, it's scary. It's the almost the perfect movie to me, and we're talking about The Shining.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
yeah. I mean, famously, Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick did not get along. Stephen King always talks about a phone conversation he had with Stanley Kubrick, calling him at a weird hour, and it just, and I guess Stanley Kubrick was kind of like having a conversation in which he was speaking to Stephen King in a way like they're both on the same page. And then, Stephen King mocking him is like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Like, why is he calling me? So it's kind of like disheartening that they didn't get along. Kubrick
Hmm.
being my favorite filmmaker and Stephen King being probably the greatest horror writer of all time. But they're both geniuses in their own right, even though they didn't get along and this doesn't stay true to the story. We saw what Stephen King's version of this story was in that made for TV miniseries. And I think we can all agree that this is the better version, of The Shining. But yeah, this is just the perfect movie. just the performances, the fact that he got the inventor of the Steadicam, who at the time he was only coming in to do like Rocky and Raging Bull, where he would coming to do like a scene or a couple scenes, and that's all he was doing for a lot of these movies, is just coming in to do a scene or a sequence. Kubrick says, "No, you're doing the whole movie." And it just the fact that they use the Steadicam for the whole movie, and they have this giant hotel where they can weave it through, and just a scene where Danny's like on that little like tricycle bicycle thing, and you see him going through the hotel. He's on the carpet, and then he's on the ground, and you hear the sound changing, and then he gets to the end of the hallway with the twins, but they really aren't twins, but they're dressed as twins, and come and play with us. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. You've had your whole life to think things over. What's a few more minutes gonna help? It's just so many classic lines and scenes. Oh my god.
Yeah,
I cannot express how much I enjoy this movie and how much I love watching it again. It just never gets old for me.
yeah. Well, it is a brilliant movie, and I first saw it probably when I was about 10 or 11 on TV, and I loved it. I had not read the book at that point. I may have read something by Stephen King, but maybe not. Well, maybe I hadn't read any of his books yet. But so I just enjoyed the movie. I loved it. And then several years later, I read the book, and I was surprised at all the differences. Like I didn't quite realize I somehow missed the controversy, I guess, because I guess a lot of the diehard fans of the book were not so happy that the movie didn't follow the book as much. There's a lot in the book that isn't really in the movie. I didn't really know about that. I guess I was only 10, so I didn't pick up on that. But reading the book years later, I thought, wow, there's a lot here that I don't remember in the movie. And I was a little worried, that when I saw the movie again, I would think, oh, yeah, this isn't right. This isn't. But I'm happy to say that watching the movie again, it's still a great movie. And I just accept it. It's not the same as the book, it's a different thing. You can enjoy the book, you can enjoy the movie. It's a great movie. I actually haven't seen the TV miniseries, to be honest. I have heard that it's a more accurate version of it, but I haven't seen it, so I
I think
can't
that's the
really.
only good thing people can say about it, is that it's
Yeah,
accurate. So
yeah,
I haven't seen it, but I've just heard about the reviews, and evidently it's
yeah.
atrocious.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
Stephen King backtracked and said, you know what? Maybe Kubrick was onto something with his version. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but but yeah, I remember even like I had to write this essay once, and it was on this subject, and I just used that subject, and I just repeated that line over and over and over again.
Oh, yeah.
So I hit the word criteria, just like as a tribute to The Shining. But yeah, it was, oh, man. There's just, you could just break down so many scenes that are just so classic and just so entertaining. And I
Hmm.
think there's certain, The Shining is a movie. When you rewatch it, you can just find new things to love about it that you didn't even notice before. So
Yeah,
famously, Kubrick and Spielberg were really good friends,
yeah.
and that's why Stanley had a movie called The Aryan Papers or something like that. I forget the exact name of the movie, but he wrote a movie about the Holocaust, but he didn't do it after he
Oh, yeah.
saw Schindler's List, because he was like, "Hey, my friend did it better. Like, what can I really add at this point?" And
Yeah,
then, obviously, famously, AI was a movie that Stanley Kubrick had, but he didn't want to shoot because he didn't feel technology was where he wanted to be. But he
hmm,
never intended to direct it.
right.
He from what from the story that Spielberg says, he was like, he was always being pitched on by Stanley on like produced by Stanley Kubrick, directed by Steven Spielberg. That
Oh,
was
yeah,
always Kubrick's intention. And then obviously the movie was done after his death as a tribute.
yeah.
Spielberg did that for his friend. But yeah, I mean, just I don't know. There's just so many aspects of what happened in front of the camera that's just so brilliant about this film, from the technology to how it was shot to some of the scenes, all of the classic Stanley Kubrick shots of people staring into the camera, looking all demented, and Jack Nicholson's performance. Here's Johnny. I was like, Jesus Christ, man! It's just such a brilliant movie red rum and all
Yes.
work and no play. Like,
And you're
dude,
wearing the shirt too, right now. You're
yes, I
wearing the
am.
shirt.
I am
Yeah.
wearing the shirt right now.
Yeah.
So,
That's great.
yeah, like I even have another shirt with the Overlook Hotel on it. I just chose to wear this
Oh,
one instead.
nice,
But
nice.
yeah, it's just such a brilliant movie. And even behind the scenes, you have, so there is one aspect of it that unfortunately did not age well, and that is Kubrick tormenting
Mm.
his lead actress. What was her name again?
Shelley Duvall.
Shelley Duvall. Yeah,
Yeah.
tormenting Shelley Duvall and their dynamic. And obviously, he'd be canceled in today's culture. But
Yeah.
even him pushing her so she keeps that energy, keeping
Hmm.
her on edge, so that when the camera starts rolling, she's still in that mind state, to give
Yeah.
the performance that he wants. But yeah, just the performances. And as I was saying before I lost my train of thought, just because I get so giddy talking about this movie, there are certain aspects of it that you notice when you rewatch it, and that's the reason I brought up Steven Spielberg originally. Is that Spielberg said he didn't really like it that much, and then Stanley said rewatch it again, and then Spielberg, according to him, said he rewatched it 10 more times and he loved it each time he's watched it since, and he's just watched it
Hmm.
endless times since the movie comes out, and he appreciates it more each time he watches it. And
Yeah.
that's the same thing for me. Like, one thing I didn't notice prior to this rewatching is everyone always says that Jack Nicholson is crazy at the beginning of the movie. One, that's not true.
Hmm.
He progressively gets crazy. And two is it's the idea that Jack Nicholson is the only person that's crazy in that movie. No, he's not. They're all fucking crazy. That whole
Yeah.
family is crazy. The kid has a little monster in his finger that's completely made up. Shelley Duvall
Yes.
is insane.
Yeah.
She loses her
Yeah.
mind just as much as Jack does. It's just that she loses her mind in hysteria, as opposed to
Yeah.
he loses his mind in anger. But the entire family is crazy. The entire family sees ghosts. They're all
Yeah.
equally over the top. It's just that they're all over the top in different ways. And that's one aspect that I didn't notice until this recent viewing. I'm like, Shelley Duvall's crazy. As much as people say like Jack is crazy, like she's completely
Yeah.
batshit insane. I love it. I love it. I love it. There's only
Yeah.
so many ways I can say I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, one of the greatest movies ever made.
Yeah. But I think that this is, not to, flog a dead horse, but this is another example of seeing the evil sort of possessing the parents, or, the father, and he becomes a threat to the family. It's kind of another version of that in a way. And, perhaps a creepy kid in some ways too, with that finger thing. Um, and the whole thing about The Shining, which I think is more explicit in the book, the sort of mental power that they have, the kid and the character, or the cook, I guess, the cook at the hotel,
Mm-hmm.
played by Scatman Carruthers. They have this
Poor
mental power.
Scatman. Poor Scatman.
Yeah.
He was
Oh,
good friends with Jack Nicholson. He begged Jack Nicholson to get him a part in the movie. And then in that scene where they're eating ice cream, famously Stanley Kubrick made him do like 80 takes until Scatman broke down and said, "Stanley, what do you want from me?" Unsurprisingly, Scatman, I think, died shortly after this movie was made. He was an old
oh
man
man.
being pushed to the edge. But yeah, I love Scatman from some of his early blaxploitation work and stuff like that, but he was great
Yeah.
in this film as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. One of the most likable characters, I would say, in the movie.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so we see some of those same sort of haunted house tropes, if you will.
Indian
Um,
Burial Ground.
Indian burial ground, yes, again, yeah. So yeah, but it's a great movie. What else can you say? Really, it's amazing performances. I think some people feel Jack Nicholson went too far over the top, but he gave the performance that is exactly what Kubrick wanted.
It's
Apparently,
funny,
he would
like
push him.
Kubrick was a big fan of James Cagney, who's maybe my favorite actor of all time. And
Yes.
he famously pushes his actors to do all these takes because he wants these takes where the characters are over the top. Because
Yes.
it's like they do it, they do it, they do it, and then eventually they get to a point where they give these takes that eventually make the movie where they're just like so over the top, because that's what he wants. And
Hmm.
famously, I think it was George C. Scott hated Kubrick because to get the performance he wanted out of George C. Scott, who was a serious actor, especially at that time in his career when he did Strangelove, was he'd say, "Why don't you give the serious performance, and then after that, we'll just do a couple takes that are just over the top."
Hmm.
And then George C. Scott trusted him,
Yeah.
and then but he wanted the takes that were like the regular performance. But then, of course, Kubrick only used the takes where George C. Scott was over the top, acting like a buffoon. He's like, bro, he's like running around acting all crazy, which is again, Strangelove was a comedy, but also the fact that Kubrick wants these over the top performances. So they
Yes.
did have a falling out. I don't know how much of a falling out because Kubrick really works with the same actors over and over again for the lead parts. Just really the guys who play like the tiny roles, they're kind of like his friends and stuff. But yeah, famously, George C. Scott hated his performance in there because he felt Kubrick betrayed him because he didn't think those takes would make it to the movie. But
Yeah.
yeah, Kubrick definitely loves those over the top performances.
Oh yeah. And I don't mind that. I come from a theater background, and I kind of like over the top as well. So
Hmm.
I never saw it as a problem. I just hear other people complain about it. And, you know, I think it works. But
I think it works brilliantly.
yeah, um, and that's interesting about the George C. Scott, because that's why, in a nutshell, film is kind of the director's medium. Because the director can kind of get the performance he wants if he knows how to manipulate the actors and work with the actors. But in theater, it's really more of the actor's medium, because once the play goes up on stage, the actors can do whatever they want, and the director can't do a thing about it. You know, so that's I think a reality of film acting versus theater acting. So coming up next is another one of my childhood favorites. This is Poltergeist, 1982, directed by Toby Hooper. But we were just talking about Spielberg, and Spielberg was very much involved in this as a writer and producer, and so much so that a lot of people actually claimed that Spielberg really directed it and that it wasn't Toby Hooper. But Spielberg has gone on record saying, nope, it's Toby Hooper's movie. He directed it. I didn't direct it. So, as far as I'm concerned, that's the end of the story there. If Spielberg says no, I think we have to accept that, right? But in any case, it's a very good movie, and I saw this in the theater, and it was one of the first movies I went to with just my friends, not no parents or anything like that. And we went and saw this movie, and I remember there was a moment where something scary happened on the screen, and I jumped back, and I basically jumped right up onto the back of my seat. I was trying to get away, and I looked over at my friend, and he was also on the back of his seat. We had both jumped back as far as we could, and I think that, in a nutshell, sums it up. It was a scary movie. We as kids, we thought this was very, very scary, and I think it's different from some, or maybe most of the other haunted house movies, or the older ones anyway, in that this haunted house, is not an old, creepy looking mansion. It's not scary looking at all, and it's not decrepit. It's not falling apart. Basically a brand new house in a modern suburb. It looks, it's kind of a very Spielbergian kind of a setting in a way. It's this sort of suburban, middle class, very happy place. And, this could be anybody's neighborhood, and what could possibly be scary about this house? It just seems like an ordinary house. But of course, it's not. And as you mentioned, the Indian burial ground raises its head again.
Yeah, we
Um,
talked about this with the Amityville Horror in that it's not the house that's haunted; it's the ground. And just
yes.
like you said, this has nothing to do with the house at all. It's a nice
Hmm.
house. It's
Yeah.
just the ground.
Yes. They built the houses on top of this ancient burial ground, this Indian burial ground, as they said. And yeah, so I think, this movie, aside from just being very good, I think that it was groundbreaking and influential in the sense that I don't think any of us really knew anything about poltergeists at this time. I think that was a term that kind of was introduced by this movie. It may get mentioned in some older movies, but not so much that we took any notice of it as audiences. But this movie, after this movie, people were talking about poltergeists all the time. And I think this movie is where we may see the kind of culmination of the experts coming to investigate the haunted house. This is like a major part of this movie. We see the experts come in with all their fancy modern equipment, their cameras and their sensors, and there's a whole team of them. And unlike some of the older movies where we're just kind of getting a hint of that starting, I think this is really where it's almost like showing us what was going to become the modern ghost hunting kind of thing that became so popular, all those reality shows and stuff like that. But
Ghost hunters. Yeah.
yeah, but unlike movies like, say, The Haunting, where things are kind of subtle and implied, everything is visible and in your face in this movie, right? This is we see a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of really state-of-the-art special effects for their time, and we have no doubt about it that this is really happening. There's no question. This isn't in anybody's head. Like when the team of experts come into the house, they're kind of saying, well, once we saw something and it took like 8 hours, but this little thing moved. It moved like 6 inches and it took 8 hours. And then they open the door to the bedroom and they see stuff flying around. Like it's just a million times more of a haunting than these people have ever seen before.
Yeah.
So
I think that's the aspect of this movie that I love the most, is that they don't waste time, not just with haunted house movies, not just with horror movies, with a lot of movies in general. A character will see something or find something out and then spend the entire movie trying to convince everyone else that it's happening.
yes,
And it's like when the mother sees these chairs move around, and then she goes to show her husband. In 99% of all movies, what would happen is the chairs wouldn't move. I'd be like, honey, what are you talking about? And he'd go to bed.
yeah,
And they would spend the next hour of the movie trying to get the husband on the same page. And then in that third act, he's going to see the chairs move and believe her. She was right the whole
yes,
time.
yeah,
This movie, she says, here, watch this. He sees it, doesn't fight with her, immediately believes it, and they're just giggling about it. And they go to the neighbors and they're just like, they can't even hold in their laughter. Like they're so excited about it. And it's
yeah,
like, instead of like being scared, she's like, hey, honey, put on this helmet. She's like, Mom, I don't want to. Put it on. It's just
yeah,
like, this isn't
yeah,
the way you're supposed to be acting in these movies,
yeah,
You're
yeah,
scared for the kid. It should take time for people to believe you. But this movie doesn't do any of that. It's so refreshing that it's just such a different take on this stuff. When the experts come in, he's like, yeah, just please don't put us on CBS on 60 Minutes. He's like, yeah, he's like, do what you want with the footage. I just don't want to be on the news with it. They're so casual about it. The way they open the door and shit is just flying around, and I don't care about any ghosts or goblins or poltergeists. I just want my kid back. They're so
yes,
pragmatic.
yes,
It's like you wish you would act that way in a situation like this. And again, it's just so different from all other movies like this. And one thing this movie does brilliantly that the first movie we talked on this list didn't do brilliantly is the humor works so well. Down
mhm,
to the last scene, from the first scene, or one of the first scenes, where the girl is watching it on TV and saying, very creepily, talking about creepy kids,
yes, yes,
they're here. And then to one of the last scenes where they go into the hotel room and he puts the TV out the door. It's like, what a
yes,
brilliant way to come full
Yes.
circle and to end the movie. It was just
Oh,
so
yeah.
brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Brilliant ending. And yes, creepy kid with the TV screen and the fuzz and that line. It's all iconic, right? Like everybody knows that. Like it's just such a famous image and a famous moment. And of course, this movie was a huge, huge hit. And they made two direct sequels to it. And I think they did a remake as well, and they might have even done some TV thing. But it's lived on as something that people love, and I think for good reason. I think it's a very good movie.
So I didn't follow this time I watched it, but I knew previous to this watching, the last time I'd watched it, I'd read up on the fact that a lot of the cast members in these movies died.
Yeah, this is one of those movies that they consider to be a cursed movie.
Yeah.
And I guess it's mainly because the little girl who stars in it as the girl who says they are here and who disappears, she died, I guess, after filming the sequel, because she's in the second film.
Mhm.
And I think it was something like a bowel blockage or something like that, some kind of medical thing that wasn't dealt with, and she died. And then the teenage girl, I believe she was murdered by her boyfriend, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
So so that is a couple of things that are very surprising because they were both young and you
Mhm.
don't expect them to die. But, I'm not sure whether I believe there's really a curse on the film. It's something that they like to talk about. And I'm not sure what else they include in that, whether there are some other
Yeah, it's been
deaths.
like I didn't
You
think it was important for this list, but I do remember, like, unrelated to this list, but just the last time I saw it, I did read up that they did view it as a cursed film because several cast members died in
Yes.
that played characters in the movies and the sequels and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So it's part of the legend, I guess, of the movie.
Hmm.
But yeah, I don't know how seriously I would take that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great movie and it still holds up today. I
Yeah.
found it enormously entertaining watching it again.
Yeah, so as far as, like, for me personally, as I said before, the previous film, The Shining, maybe one of my favorite movies of all time. Maybe only second to, like, maybe like 2001: A Space Odyssey, maybe
Mm,
Seven Samurais up there. There's
yeah.
it's right up there with one of my favorite movies ever made. And then for me, for my personal taste, I love movies like The Innocents and The Haunting, where it's just like all that psychological stuff going on. But as far
Yes.
as, like, execution goes, as far as, like, a blockbuster, like just a movie that you could recommend to anybody of any age, or you could just sit down with family members and not be like, uh-oh, when this scene comes up, I don't want to be in the room with a kid, or I don't want to be in the room with my mother, or I don't want to
Hmm.
be in the room with whatever. This is a movie you can watch with anyone, anytime, and I think they're all going to enjoy it. This is one of the most universal, really good horror movies, definitely for this list. It's a real crowd pleaser. It's funny, it's scary, it's entertaining, it's well paced. It has a great beginning with the creepy girl, a funny ending that gives a callback.
Hmm.
Everything makes sense. The special effects hold up despite how old the movie is. I think just overall, when you're just talking about crowd pleasing blockbusters, when you're talking about, like, movies like The Avengers, kind of crowd pleaser you're talking about, as far as horror movies goes, this is good as it gets as far as that to me.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's very, very good.
So let's get into a movie that's the opposite of what you just say.
It's very, very good.
Okay. So let's see. What's the opposite of very, very good? Paranormal Activity. So, this movie 100% belongs on this list. Several sequels, hugely profitable, probably cost a couple $100. Famously, a lot of the budget renovating his house, the filmmaker's
Mm,
house, because he was like, yes, when I made the film, I didn't feel my house looked like a haunted house, so a lot of the budget was me just renovating my house. So basically, he just did this film to write off renovations to his house, which is massive. As small as this budget is, it's probably just $100, or maybe the cost of catering. A movie that took very little effort. It looks like they didn't even try. There's nothing artistic about it. Just the acting is atrocious. People always say the funniest scene is when that who's that ghost guy that comes in? I don't know what his title was, but they call in that guy to help them out to know if there are
Yeah,
ghosts in his house.
yeah.
And the scene where he comes in, his second scene where he's like, oh, there are ghosts in this house. Oh, I gotta go. Like, I can't stay in this house. I gotta go. The acting in that scene was just some of the worst acting I've porn acting is better than his acting. That guy was the worst actor. That was one of the worst scenes I've seen in a movie. And people view that as like a funny scene and like it's intentionally funny. I viewed it, it's cringy funny. The acting in this movie is cringy, and that's one of the cringiest scenes I've ever seen. And I've seen The Room. I was happy to know even the filmmaker said he was worried about that scene because he wasn't sure if people were laughing at the acting or if they were laughing at the fact that he didn't want to be in the house. I think a lot of people that love the movie are laughing because he wanted to get out of the house, but I'm with the filmmaker. I just thought the acting was just fucking atrocious. I love low budget movies. I'm a low budget filmmaker. This budget for this movie is probably in line, minus the renovations for the house, in line with the movies I make. So part of me loves the fact that a movie of this budget made over $100 million, but the other part of me is like, this movie didn't even try. Like a movie like House, I didn't love it. I didn't even like it that much. But you could see the effort that was put into it. I don't see any effort in this. There's nothing artistic, scary. I don't know. The best scene in the movie was a scene that Spielberg had them redo, which was the ending where Michael goes flying at the camera. And that was a
Mm.
scene that Spielberg wanted them to redo because the original ending was just kind of like her just sitting there for hours in a time lapse scene until the cops came. I think there were like three endings, but the
Uh,
Spielberg ending was the only one that was any good. Yeah, I don't know if I made it clear. I don't like this movie. I don't like it. I 100% definitely needs to be on this list for the reasons I mentioned before, but I do not like this movie at all.
wow. Wow. I think I enjoyed it more than you did. But I see what you're saying. It is a very, very simple, low budget affair. It's not got a lot of anything like personality or, you know, maybe not great performances. But I think it's more about the idea and the fact that it did work. You know, it sort of it worked for the audience. People loved it. It was a huge success. Like it was, I guess, in that sort of same way as Blair Witch. It kind of struck a chord with people, and it worked for them. But yeah, it's not by any means a great movie, and it's certainly not my favorite on this list. Um, it's another movie in which we have a very normal looking house, right? It's not a scary house. It's kind of like Poltergeist in that way. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's mostly just the two actors. We see that other guy come in a couple of times. Was there anybody else? Was there a friend, or I can't remember now.
There were a couple
Uh,
other people, but
yeah,
yeah, it was just mainly the Micah and Katie.
yeah. So I think really the most interesting thing about it is how successful it was. You know, like
Hmm.
it really worked for them. They made a hit movie with
Yeah,
very little.
I think what the main thing that did this movie that made this movie successful was the fact that I think DreamWorks was the first company that had it. But I think DreamWorks was sold to Paramount or something. But I knew
Oh
there was
yeah,
some kind of acquisition in which the movie went from one distribution company to another distribution company. And in that transfer, the new company didn't really have any movies to distribute for a few months except this one. There were a bunch of blockbusters on the road, but as far as the timeline, there was really nothing for them to do except this movie. So they had the entire advertising department, the entire company, just sitting on this movie. And I think they made a great ad campaign subsequent to that. Instead of focusing on several movies, they only focused on this. And I think the advertising for the movie is what really made it a hit. Don't watch this movie. Spielberg says it's the scariest movies he's ever seen. The footage of audiences screaming, it could have been paid actors for all we know. What I think the advertising campaign is what really got people to drink the Kool-Aid for this movie. Drinking the Kool-Aid, you see the callback?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Yes.
but
Indeed.
but yeah, I think the advertising was really helped this movie. We've seen movies like this before. We've seen movies that cost nothing, that made all the money, that just took over the conversation, and generally it's horror films. They just took over the conversation for months of moviegoers, and just just became part of the zeitgeist of that time that it came out. Off the top of my head, we have like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Probably had a similar budget to this, made similar money maybe for the time. Night of the Living Dead, Evil Dead. I don't know if that was successful or not. Financially, I should say. I don't know if it was a cult hit or if it made a lot of money. Blair Witch Project. I'm sure if I thought about it, it could be more. But those are just a handful of movies that are just like this, where they're just not made in Hollywood. They're made independently. They cost nothing, and then they make all the money in the world. To me, all those movies I mentioned are like 10 times better than this one. This movie is just so it's not that I don't like these stories or these type of movies, but I just thought all those movies I mentioned had some level of effort and art and care and message. This is just a guy that just like gave an actor a camera and said, "Okay, edit some scenes for me. You're the husband and you're the boyfriend, you're the girlfriend. Just talk now." And basically, when you I was just so fascinated at like how this movie made money when I watched the behind the scenes footage. Everything I thought about this movie was true. The scene with the bad acting, the director thought that was bad acting. The fact that the director didn't give any effort, he basically said, like he was talking about one of the scenes in the commentary. He was like, "Yeah, when they shot this scene, I was at my friend's house." He wasn't even there while they were shooting some of the scenes.
Oh man.
I don't know. I don't. Did I make it clear? I don't like this movie.
Yes, you've made it clear. I think, I enjoyed it more than you. I think if you haven't seen it, you could do worse than take a look at it. I don't think it's going to be your favorite movie of any of these movies on the list. I agree. I'd rather watch the other ones you're talking about. But, it didn't really offend me. It's certainly, I was entertained enough by it for its short running time, I think. So, and I can admire the fact that they did this thing with very little money and became a cultural phenomenon. So it's kind of interesting for that reason.
I guess for me, the aspect of it that I don't like is there are plenty of bad movies that make a lot of money. Like those Fast and Furious movies. I mean, maybe people love them. I hate them. They make a shitload of money. I guess what offends me more about this is go outside the realm of filmmaking, right? If you see people at your workplace or people in public or people people you don't know, just people you see that give no effort, and they're constantly rewarded for it, and they're promoted for it. Would you like that person? No. This is a movie that gave no effort and is rewarded for it. So that's my perspective. That's why I dislike it so much. It's not that I dislike the filmmaker. I'm happy for them. I'm happy that a filmmaker who like did this for no budget was able to go on and do other things. Now most of these people didn't go on to do much because look at what they did. I mean,
Yeah.
at some point, it's like the emperor with no clothes. At some point, they're gonna look past the facade and realize, wait, these people really can't act. This guy really can't direct a movie. It's like at some point they're gonna get past that. But I'm happy for them in that they got like maybe some notoriety and a few projects after this.
Yeah.
But I'm just not a big fan of seeing people get rewarded for no effort. And I think
Yeah.
that's what bothered me about this. It's
Yeah.
if they had the same budget, but they actually tried, to me, Blair Witch, at least they tried. Evil Dead had no money, but they tried. Night of the Living
Mhm.
Dead, no money, they tried. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they tried.
Yeah.
Those are the stories I admire, where people who
Yeah.
don't come in, give a half-assed effort and said, you're getting a raise. It's like, what? Busting my ass over here. Why is he getting a raise? Shows up late to work every day, doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
So I guess just to give an analogy, that's kind of why I don't like it. But we can move on.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's fair enough, and I think I had no idea in terms of the effort level. I haven't seen any behind the scenes stuff, so I
You've seen the
probably
movie.
I've seen the movie, yes, but
Do you see
I
any efforts
sort
on screen?
well, that's hard to gauge, but I can hear what you're saying. That yeah, when people are rewarded for no effort or for shoddy work, then yeah, that's not the greatest. And yeah, I can see what you're saying for sure. The Conjuring from 2013, which I feel like we've been building up to here because we've been talking about the Warrens and we've been talking about other movies like the Amityville Horror. And yeah, this is kind of the culmination of all that. This is a movie actually about the Warrens. And it is the first movie in the so-called Conjuring universe, which now apparently contains about 8 movies. I must admit I've only seen this first one. I haven't seen any of the sequels or the offshoots or whatever. This is the only one I saw. And I did really enjoy it. I thought it was very well done. I thought it was very effective. I bought the Blu-ray, which I have here. So, I did consider this to be a movie that I liked. But I think when The Conjuring 2 came out, I read an article by somebody who was saying, the case that they've chosen to cover in The Conjuring 2 is one that is clearly a fraud. It's clearly a fake. And they're covering it in this movie as if it's real. And that seems to be a little problematic. And I thought, yeah, I can kind of see that point. And I didn't, as a result, I didn't see The Conjuring 2. But I still felt like I liked this movie and I enjoyed this movie. And I still did enjoy it watching it again, but I found myself thinking about it in that way. Like, how much is this a true story and how much of this is something that may be completely fabricated? And I don't know the answer to that, but I feel they present the Warrens as if they are completely above board, as if this is all absolutely true. And they don't really even, I don't think they even show that there are people out there who disagree with them and who think that they are frauds. I don't think they really show that at any point in this movie. So it feels a little bit dishonest in that way. Like, these characters are a bit controversial in real life. People either think that they were for real or they think they were frauds, but I don't think we get that balance in here. Now, does that matter? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that matters, because it is a very well-made movie. It's very effective, and it's it's, I guess one of the things I find a little bit strange about it is, again, it's got this divided perspective, because on the one hand, we're kind of following the Warrens around, but on the other hand, we're kind of seeing things from the point of view of the family. And I think it would have been better if it was one or the other. I think if it was all about the Warrens, that could have been a different movie. And if it was all about the family and the Warrens just kind of come in and do their thing, like Poltergeist kind of is about the family, it's not about the investigators, I don't know. I found that to be a bit of a difficult
It's interesting that
kind.
you bring that up because in some of the behind the scenes footage I saw, James Wan was saying that he always wanted to make a movie about the Warrens. So you kind of
Yeah,
wonder, was it made about the family? And then when James Wan come in, he wanted the Warrens to be a bigger part of it. That
yeah,
could be a possibility, because he
yeah,
did mention that. But I do agree. It's like, wait a minute, who's the lead actor and actress in this movie? Like, is it
yeah,
the husband and wife Warrens, or is it the husband and wife family that's being haunted?
yeah, exactly. And I mean, there seems to be a story there with the Warrens that um, she is sort of suffering. Like every time she goes through one of these things, it seems to take something from her. She's potentially weakening herself, and I mean that could be a compelling story, but yeah, I don't know. In some ways, should it just be about the family and their experience? I don't know, but it kind of plays a little bit like in a way, a greatest hits package of previous haunted house stories, and particularly maybe because it's the Warrens. Um, but we have a scene where there's a static on the TV, which right away kind of evokes Poltergeist to me. When they show that image, I think, like, why would they do that unless that was a deliberate reference to Poltergeist?
Yeah, the Warrens
Uh,
saw Poltergeist, and then they claimed that there's ghosts in the TV.
yeah, and there's also a dog that knows something's wrong here, and there's a
Yeah,
little
they
girl.
saw the Uninvited too.
Yes, and there's a little girl who's sort of playing and talking to somebody who isn't there. Might be a ghost.
Mhm.
And we bring the team of
I think maybe they
experts
saw the
into the
bad
house.
seed for that one.
Yeah, the team of experts coming in, very much like Poltergeist in that
Mhm.
way.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is a story that is ultimately about one of the parents, and in this case, it's the mother, who's kind of becoming possessed by the evil and may be a threat to the child. And so it feels very much like the Amityville Horror in that sense, and the fact that they supposedly worked on that, haunting, it's interesting because a lot of the same things are here. So is it a case of people are taking the same ideas and using them again? Or is it a coincidence that they happen to involve these similar things? I don't know. But the ultimate kind of punchline for it is at the very end of the movie, and this isn't really a spoiler, but at the very end, they mention that there's a case on Long Island that they want to go look into. And of course, that's the Amityville Horror, right? They're making
Mhm.
reference. So that's their next case. They're going to go from here to the Amityville Horror. And my understanding is that they actually do that at the beginning of part two, but I haven't seen part two, so I can't say. But I do think it's a very well made movie. I think it's well acted. I think there's a lot of good uh, haunted house action in this movie. I just find myself kind of stuck on that question of, is this movie just complete BS? Is this just complete? I don't know. I'm not sure, because they're saying that this is the true story of
Mhm.
the Warrens, and they're presenting it in a way that doesn't even feel like there's any controversy there. It's like, this is just real. This is what really happened. I don't know. I'm just not sure how to feel about that at this point. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I think there are two ways to look at this. One is to separate the Warrens from the movie, or you're never going to be able to get any headway because it's going
Yeah,
to be too conflicting.
yeah,
Looking at it as just a movie, leaving the Warrens out of it, looking at the quality, it's a well-made movie. And
yes,
I spoke earlier about like low-budget movies that cost nothing, generally horror movies that made a fortune and just went on to either have like a franchise or just make like a shitload of money relative to the budget. One movie I left out is Saw. Saw was another movie
mhm,
like that. Saw was
yes,
directed by James Wan, just like this movie. See if I can
yes.
tie that all together
Oh
again
yeah, yeah. Masterful.
here. So yeah, as far as like the James Wan is probably his best directed film. I know he's directed several. It's probably his best job as far as like a well polished movie. Like I probably enjoy Saw more than this, but this is probably a well-polished movie. Good actors, good acting, good performances, good cinematography, great budget. Everything was executed. Costumes, because it's somewhat of a time period movie. Everything was executed very well. It's a blockbuster. It deserved to make a lot of money. It's a good horror movie. Is it the type of horror movie I would watch? It's a little too commercial for me. There's not a lot of interesting things there. I like the psychological stuff, like I mentioned before, movies that push certain boundaries. This is like a safe Fast X, what Fast X is to action movies, or what the Avengers is to comic book movies. It's a safe movie that everyone can watch, but there's nothing about it that's that interesting to me. Is it good? Yes. Is it my cup of tea? No. Does it belong on this list? Absolutely. It's a huge profited movie, made a lot of money, very influential, ton of fans, multiple sequels, spin-off sequels with the Annabelle stuff. Kind of,
Hmm.
it's like kind of like All in the Family of
Yeah.
Mook, because All in the Family
Oh
then
yeah.
they didn't just go on and have multiple seasons. It had multiple spin-off shows that had multiple seasons. So this
That's right.
had not just multiple movies, but it had spin-off movies that had multiple movies. So it
Yes.
just spawned a lot of stuff. So yes, this definitely belongs. Looking at the Warren aspect of it, to me, that's where it gets icky.
Yeah.
Because one, they're frauds. Two, this movie makes them out to be everything they're not.
Hmm.
Like they do things not for the money, they do things for the money. They claim that certain places they go to aren't haunted. They claim everywhere they go to. It's like it portrays them out to be not just the opposite of what they are, but they make them out to be these altruistic heroes that just want to do nothing but the right thing. That should be, we should worship them. It almost comes off as propaganda
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
Warrens. And then
Yeah.
when you read about the fact that even back then people thought they were bullshit artists, and then you read about the fact that, so again, with with firsthand accounts of sexual abuse. I mean, you want to be careful with that stuff because even with Me Too, you see that sometimes people just lie.
Hmm.
There was a point where it's like, well, why would a woman come out and lie about sexual abuse? Well, you know what? After Me Too, there are a lot of people that went down, like Harvey Weinstein and stuff like that. But then when you really examine it, there are people that come out and just lie. After Me Too's been out for a while, you realize, wait a minute, some guys were just wrongfully accused and their careers were destroyed for no reason. So I don't want to like say this woman that came out against the Warrens is 100% true because
Hmm.
she could just be lying. But
Yeah.
supposedly, while they did sexually abuse women, one woman in particular said when she was 15, she was having sex with the Warrens, and then they moved her into the house, and she came out publicly with it. So I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying what she's saying is true, but those allegations are out there. And also is put into their contract that none of that stuff could be mentioned in the movie. So
Yeah.
are they putting that stuff out there because, you know what, they were wrongfully accused and they're just protecting their names? Or they know that, listen, that woman came out, more women may come out. You can't talk about this stuff in any way or and it's written in the contract. So you have to take all that stuff into account when the filmmakers choose to have the Warrens be a part of the movie and choose to portray the Warrens the way they do. You can't fully divorce yourself of that. You can have a movie that's the greatest movie of all time, but if then in that movie they're portraying Hitler to be a hero, you can have a lot of people saying, yeah, it's a well executed movie, but like,
Yeah.
did you have to make Hitler the hero? It's kind of
Yeah.
like what's that movie with the Klansmen are the hero? The early
Birth,
1900s movies, Birth of a
Birth of a
Nation,
Nation. Yeah.
Birth of a Nation, where the Klansmen are the heroes. It's like you can
Yeah.
acknowledge, yeah, this was a great movie, but so
Yeah.
yes, it's a good movie, but making the Warrens a part of it just kind of makes it feel icky for me. But yes, it was a
Yeah.
well executed movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you've just made it even worse. I didn't know some of those things, but yes, it just raises even more questions about it. And again, maybe it would have been a better movie if they just focused on the family, And you could have the Warrens appear in it, but they could be figures that are a little uncertain. Like, I don't know, are these guys real? Do we trust these guys? Some people say they're phonies. And then it's at least kind of a, I don't know what's the word. It's kind of a gray area. But when you make them characters that seem to be above reproach, it's questionable, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, I don't. For me, like maybe saying it's based on a true story made them have a lot, made the movie more profitable. To me, I mean, come on, based on true. We're in 2023. Are people really going to say, "Oh, because it said based on a true story, ghosts are real, and now I
Yeah,
believe this is real, and this is going to make me go out to the theater more than if they didn't say it was based on a true story"? I don't know if that helped them in any kind of a way. If it was just a
yeah,
completely fictional story and left the Warrens out of it, I don't know if this would have made $1 less, you
yeah,
know? So,
yeah. Yeah, that's true. They could have just made it as a fictionalized story, and they could have followed the same. They could have used the whole history of the Warrens' case, but without saying that's what it is. The same way Psycho is based on Ed Gein or whatever,
mm,
but it doesn't say that, right? They don't use his name ever. It's just inspired by that, right?
yeah, yeah, and you would have been safe. Doing a full recap of our list. We started off with The Cat and the Canary. Not the greatest film in the world, but it's from 1927. It's a silent film. It's one of the very early horror films that's still preserved today. Definitely one of the first haunted house films. Does use a lot of humor, which, again, by today's standards, some of that slapstick stuff isn't hasn't aged well. It does hammer home that title and the premise of the movie a lot. But overall, an interesting movie, interesting visuals. Like you said, they use a German expressionist director to get those interesting visuals out there. For me, I listened to a version without any soundtrack or music. So to me, that added more to the horror element because you just had the complete silence. And watching a horror movie in silence is scary enough. Watching a horror movie in silence without any audio on the movie itself as well is even more scary because when the scares happen, it's just like you hear your fridge go off while you're watching a horror movie. It makes you jump a little bit more. So for me, that enhanced the experience. You said you watched a version that had a soundtrack on it.
Yes, I did. Yes, and I mean, I like that, but I don't know if it would have been better without, or it worked for me with the soundtrack, but yeah, it was what it was, I guess. I enjoyed the film, and I think it is very influential in that old dark house kind of genre.
Next up, we have The Uninvited from 1944. That, again, built up a lot of tropes. It wasn't the first movie that coined the term haunted house. That was The Old Dark House, which came out in between these two movies. But again, it did establish a lot of the tropes that we still see today. And it added a lot of the mystery element where you have something that happens, and then the characters go off on this journey where they try to discover what happened, why it happened, and they just solve the mystery, and then everything comes together at the end. And that's kind of like the flow of a lot of how these movies play out now. Unlike the first movie, in this movie, the ghosts are real.
Yes, absolutely. And it may be the first movie to do that. It's certainly one of the first movies to do that. So, very important film.
Next up, we have two movies from the 60s, 1961, The Innocents, and 1963, The Haunting. And these are both very different movies, but they're also both kind of mature movies made for adults, whereas a lot of these horror movies were kind of made for kids or made with some kind of humor. This fully developed the fact, it started with The Uninvited, but now it kind of fully developed the fact that, listen, horror movies can be for adults, haunted house, ghost movies can be for adults. You don't always have to sprinkle in the humor. These are both very much psychological movies from the perspective of a female lead, how much is going on in the movie, how much is going on in her head. Both executed very differently. The Innocents has a lot of great writing by Truman Capote based on a book. The Haunting also based on a book. There's a little bit of humor in there. Maybe some of it's intentional, maybe some of it's not intentional, but they're both very good movies, both made in the early 60s.
Absolutely. And both kind of scary in their own way, perhaps more so than the older ones. These ones are scary ghost stories worth watching.
Next up, we have House from 1977, the only foreign movie on this list. A lot of good foreign Japanese movies that are horror, like The Ring and The Eye, and just several that were remade, especially in the early 2000s. Dark Water. But this one, I don't think this has been remade. Very much an art house film. So it's an art house, it's a foreign film, and those are represent two things that otherwise wouldn't be on this list. Very unique film, low budget. The story of it's very interesting. It was a passion project by a director. It took him 4 years to make after it got it greenlit. It was very financially successful. It does have a strong cult following. So those are all elements that makes it worth watching. It may not be the easiest watch, but it's definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not for everybody at the end of the day, and I'm not sure it's for me either. But it's definitely worth checking it out because it is very unique. It's very much its own thing.
Next up, we have the Amityville Horror, which is one of the early horror franchises that spawned several sequels. Obviously, you had the Universal ones, Frankenstein, and you had several Frankenstein movies. But these are one of the early horror movies where it's just Amityville Horror 1, 2, 3, kind of stuff like that. And it's a very low budget movie, made a ton of money. We'll talk about another low budget movie that made a ton of money on this list. But that seems to be the theme for a lot of horror movies, is to just keep the costs down, try to keep the profit high, get people in the theaters with scares. The whole based on a true story trope, Indian burial ground trope, a lot of that stuff is in this movie. For personal reasons, one of your favorites. For me, this doesn't have any personal connection, but I still feel for a 1979 horror movie, it has aged very well, and I was thoroughly entertained by it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it, of course, and I think it's historically very important and should be seen by anyone who's interested in haunted house movies.
Next up, we have The Shining in 1980, the Stanley Kubrick classic. As I've stated throughout this podcast, one of my favorite movies ever made, my favorite horror movie by far. Absolute classic, great performances, great direction, innovative stuff using the Steadicam for almost the entire movie. One of the first movies to do this. The helicopter shots were amazing. The music, the composition, the cinematography, just for me, like a perfect movie. One of the best movies you're ever going to see if you haven't seen it yet. And if you have seen it, it's one of those movies where rewatching it, you always find something new to love about it.
Yeah, it's probably a masterpiece. You know, let's be honest, it's a masterpiece. But it may not be for everybody who's a fan of Stephen King if they, get upset that it's a little different from the book. But I say it exists separately from the book. You have to look at it as its own thing. And I enjoyed the book, but I also really like the movie. So I say, yeah, it's a good movie. Check it out.
Next up, we have Poltergeist from 1982. For me, this is a refreshing horror movie. It's just a refreshing movie in general, in that these characters don't react in the way that movie characters react. They kind of go against the grain in a lot of ways, and they're very pragmatic. They're almost how I wish I would be if something weird happened to me. Honestly, I'd probably freak out and just like run in a corner and cry in my closet. But these characters are very pragmatic. They have a situation in front of them, and they just deal with it in the most sensible, level-headed way as possible, which is not what you'd expect from typical movies, and especially a movie that's intended to scare, where you would expect people to freak out. They just keep a calm head. The movie is extremely well executed. Steven Spielberg producing. It was a wonder why. Tobe Hooper directing it. The same guy who brought us a few years before Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So he showed he's grown as a filmmaker as well. We want to make several other great movies. This also spawned a franchise from the first scene to they're here with that classic line to that hilarious scene where they just put the TV outside of the hotel room to classic scenes where the house is eating itself. It's just an incredibly memorable movie. And it's the only movie on this list where I would watch it with anyone. I'd watch it with my mother. I'd watch it with a little kid. I'd watch it with a date. This is just a universal crowd-pleasing movie.
Yeah, absolutely. This movie is great. It's scary. It's fun. It's funny. It's entertaining in every way, and it is iconic. and I would recommend it to anyone as well.
Paranormal Activity, not my favorite movie. I did go hard on it. Part of that was for comedic purposes, but I'm generally not a huge fan of it because it didn't really, it's not a movie that the amount of praise and money this movie got, critical praise, fan praise, cult following, financial success, to me, that is disproportionate with the amount of effort that was put into the movie. So I guess honestly, that's the only thing I think that I don't like about it is that it's praise and it's money and it's just not warranted based on the end result product. But overall, it's an important movie because it keeps that tradition of these low budget movies that show that, listen, if you have a camera and a dream, you can make it happen. And from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Saw, uh, Night of the Living Dead, Evil Dead, and several other movies that I'm not thinking of right now, these movies that cost nothing, they just have a guy with a camera and a dream. This shows that that's still alive and running today.
Absolutely, and I did find the movie to be entertaining, and I don't think it's the greatest movie on this list, and I probably wouldn't watch it as often, but I do think it's worth checking out to see an example of what can be done with very little, and how it can be very successful in spite of its shortcomings.
Next, we have our most contemporary movie on this list, The Conjuring from 2013. So, if you follow the backstory, this can be a divisive movie, but if you don't follow it, just look at it at face value. It is a very entertaining movie that not only spawns sequels, but it spawns spin off movies that also had sequels. So, if you just look at it for what it is an entertaining movie. Yes, if you look past the surface, there's a lot there. The maggots are thriving is a term that comes to mind. On the outside, it looks good, but on the inside, those maggots, they're eating, boy. So look out. Just as far as the movie itself, look past the propaganda, look past the real life stuff. It is an entertaining movie. It has spawned a lot for the filmmakers and the actors and subsequent movies as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it is very effective, it's very well done. I do question some of the behind the scenes or behind the true story or whatever. I'm not sure how to feel about it in that way, but yeah, I think as a movie and nothing else, it is a very good movie, and certainly a worth watching haunted house film for sure.
Yeah. So again, this is the essential list, not the best, but after just two guys who watch films their whole life, you write for TV shows, I make independent movies, so we do part of our living does come from this industry. I've made horror movies before. I'm sure you've worked on horror movies or movies that have horror elements in there. We're not just doing this somewhat professionally, but we also are huge fans. So, from our perspective, we have spent a lot of time researching these movies. We've spent a lifetime watching these movies. We did put a lot of thought into this list. And for us, this is our essential list. Not the best, but these are the most essential, most important ones. If you're not familiar with haunted house movies, if you want to learn from them, if you're taking a film course and you have to study them, these are the movies that are worth delving into, whether it's in front of the camera, behind the scenes, the timing of when it came out, the cultural impact, factoring all of those things in, not just, well, this movie was entertaining to me, factoring everything in. These are the top 10 most essential, most important movies that can be categorized in this sub horror genre of haunted house films. At the end of the day, we went from when we were deliberating what movies should or shouldn't be on this list to when we watched them to now that we're completing this podcast. I'm very happy with this list. Nothing in here I would change. What about yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy with it. I think we could probably do another top 10 list of haunted house movies, or at least a list of 10 haunted house movies that we love, and probably still not run out. I think there's a lot of other great haunted house movies, but I'm very happy with this list, and I'm glad that we decided to talk about them.
Yeah, that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. We do take a lot of time and effort to that we put into this stuff. We hope you guys like what you see. Likes, follow, subscribe, and follow Angus on Twitter. I guess that's where you have your biggest following. Me,
Yes.
I'm on various forms of social media. I'm not always up to date with everything, but probably YouTube, where this is going to be, is where you can probably check me out the most. All right. Thanks for watching, guys.
Thank you.